The night air inside the asylum was heavy with damp stone and the faint metallic tang of rusted iron. Somewhere in the corridor, a scream tore through the silence, sharp and unending, only to collapse into sobs muffled by thick walls. Lanterns flickered against peeling paint, casting grotesque shadows that danced like broken spirits across the floor. In these halls, madness was not a metaphor, it was a living presence, a constant wail that echoed through barred windows and echoed in the hearts of those trapped within. Was the human mind a divine mystery, or merely a broken machine to be fixed with force? This was the dilemma of an age that could neither heal nor understand the torments of the soul. For centuries, mental illness had been branded as possession, weakness, or crime. Families abandoned their afflicted to institutions where silence and neglect did the work of medicine. And yet, within the darkness, there always lingered a faint ember of hope that somehow, somewhere, there might be a cure. The 19th century was an age of contradictions. Science surged forward with discoveries in electricity, anatomy, and chemistry, yet mental health remained bound in superstition and cruelty. Asylums multiplied across Europe and America, promising safety but often delivering confinement. Patients, men and women, children and the elderly alike, were restrained in straitjackets, shackled to iron bedsteads, or confined to padded cells where their cries went unheard. The asylum was not merely a building, it was a society's shadow. In these wards lived the poor, the unwanted, the inconvenient, women too rebellious, soldiers too broken, children too restless, all found themselves behind the same locked doors. Madness was defined not only by medical ignorance, but by social intolerance. And yet, there was an odd duality. Alongside cruelty existed a movement of compassion, the so-called moral treatment that sought to soothe patients with clean clothes, gardens, and gentle routines. But such methods were fragile, constantly overshadowed by overcrowding and lack of resources. The image of serenity crumbled beneath the weight of reality. Too many patients, too few doctors, and a society eager to forget the afflicted once they had been hidden away. In these conditions, the search for a cure became desperate. Physicians, confronted with endless suffering and mounting frustration, turned to radical ideas. Bloodletting, purging, spinning chairs to jolt the brain, even ice baths, all were tried. All failed. Yet each attempt revealed something essential, that doctors no longer saw madness as purely spiritual. Increasingly, they turned their gaze inward to the fragile organ behind the skull. The brain became the battlefield of science. What if, they wondered, madness was not a curse of the soul but a misfiring of nerves? What if the key to sanity lay in cutting, probing, altering? These questions stirred beneath the lantern light of late-night laboratories among men who believed progress demanded sacrifice. But before the knife ever touched the brain, history had already experimented with breaking open the skull. Trepanation boring holes into the head had existed since prehistory. Skulls from ancient Peru, Egypt, and Europe show evidence of this crude surgery, sometimes with signs of healing, suggesting survival. Was it magic? Was it medicine? The line blurred. What united them was a belief that the head and what lay within held the mysteries of suffering. Thus, as the asylum filled with cries and silence alike, an idea grew in whispers. Perhaps the only way to restore sanity was to cut into the very seat of thought. By the late 19th century, neurological science was blooming. Discoveries of Broca's area and Wernicke's area linked brain regions to speech and comprehension. The theory of localized brain function gained strength. If one region could control words, Could another control madness? Could a surgeon's hand, steady with scalpel, excise despair as though it were a tumor? It was a dangerous marriage. Science's hunger for certainty with society's hunger for solutions. The asylum was overcrowded, doctors overwhelmed, families desperate. A procedure that promised to quiet a screaming patient, to render them docile, to return them home even diminished, was not merely medical. It was salvation wrapped in steel. Yet every salvation carries its shadow. Imagine the silence after the hammer strike of an ice pick. Imagine a woman, once rebellious, sitting in a chair, docile and vacant, her family sighing with relief and sorrow intertwined. Imagine a soldier, once haunted by the thunder of war, reduced to calm obedience, his memories erased with the flick of a surgeon's wrist. These images belonged to the future, but their seeds were planted here, in the darkness of asylums where hope grew desperate. The story of the lobotomy does not begin with the procedure itself. It begins with the need, the relentless need for control, for answers, for a way to transform chaos into order. Humanity has always sought to master what it fears, and madness was perhaps its most terrifying mystery. Philosophers of the age ask quietly, what is sanity? Is it the presence of reason, or simply the absence of disturbance? If a person is silenced, are they healed or erased? These questions would grow sharper in the decades to come, as surgeons turned ideas into incisions. But here, in the 19th century asylum, the stage was set. The screams of patients, the clatter of chains, the sterile promise of science, all converged into one inevitable trajectory. Toward the scalpel, toward the ice pick, toward silence. Reflection. Every age believes it seeks healing, yet in its desperation, it risks creating new wounds. When we look upon the shadows of the past, we must ask, is it mercy to quiet the mind, or cruelty to extinguish it? The asylum door creaked open on its iron hinges, and the air that drifted out was thick with a mixture of sweat, disinfectant, and despair. Inside, rows of figures slumped in corners, their eyes wide with terror or dulled by exhaustion. Some muttered endlessly to themselves, reciting fractured prayers or half-remembered songs. Others rocked back and forth, bound in coarse restraints that rubbed their skin raw. The silence of those who had given up was the heaviest of all, a silence more suffocating than screams. This was the landscape of treatment before the scalpel, a grim theater where medicine and cruelty coexisted in uneasy alliance. To understand why lobotomy would one day be hailed as salvation, one must first walk these corridors of shadows, where the insane were both pitied and punished, studied and abandoned. The weight of madness in early societies. For centuries, madness was viewed through the lens of fear. Ancient Greeks spoke of divine punishment. Medieval Christians often saw possession by demons. Villages shunned those afflicted, and families, unable to cope, sometimes abandoned them at monasteries or almshouses. The mad were locked away, not to heal, but to protect society from their perceived danger. By the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideals spread across Europe, whispers of reform began to circulate. Reason and science declared that madness might not be sin, but sickness. Yet old habits lingered. Those deemed insane were chained in dungeons, paraded before curious visitors as spectacles of terror. The hospital was not always a place of healing. It was often a prison with another name: restraints and repression. In asylums, restraint became both cure and curse. Heavy iron shackles bound ankles and wrists. Patients were lashed to benches, or confined in small wooden boxes barely larger than coffins. The infamous tranquilizing chair, invented in the late 18th century, locked patients into immobility for hours, with straps across chest and limbs. The rationale was simple. Stillness would quiet the storm of madness. In truth, it often broke the body while leaving the mind untouched. Ice baths shocked patients into silence, plunging them into freezing water until their skin turned blue. Spinning chairs whirled them in violent circles under the belief that rearranging the fluids of the body might reorder the chaos of the brain. Bloodletting, purging, blistering, all inflicted in the name of balance. To the modern eye, these treatments seem barbaric, yet to those who administered them they were progress. In an age without tranquilizers, without antipsychotics, without any real understanding of neurology, the only tools were restraint and shock. To calm a screaming patient by any means was, in the eyes of many doctors, a kind of victory. The rise of moral treatment. Amid this bleakness, rays of compassion appeared. In France, Philippe Pinel famously unchained patients at the Bicêtre Hospital in 1793, declaring that madness should be met with humanity, not punishment. In England, William Tuke established the York Retreat, where patients were treated with kindness, routine, and work in gardens. This movement, called moral treatment, emphasized dignity and the healing power of environment. For a time, it seemed as though society might turn away from cruelty. Patients wore clean clothes, walked in fresh air, ate decent meals. Doctors sought to engage with their thoughts, not simply suppress their bodies. Some recovered, many did not. Yet even the illusion of progress carried hope. But moral treatment demanded resources, staff, money, space that quickly dwindled as asylums filled. By the mid-19th century, overcrowding crushed reform. What began as gardens of mercy became once again warehouses of despair. The cycle repeated, restraint returned, chains reappeared, and silence was once more imposed by force. Madness as a social mirror. The treatments of the insane reflected not only medicine but society's deepest anxieties. Women who defied their roles were diagnosed with hysteria and subjected to rest cures or forced institutionalization. Soldiers broken by war were branded cowards, their trembling bodies punished rather than soothed. Children too unruly were deemed defective and hidden away. In this way, asylums became more than hospitals. They were mirrors of control. Those who did not fit the mold of obedience were pathologized, their cries muffled by medicine's authority. Madness was feared, not just because it was incomprehensible, but because it defied order. Society, obsessed with discipline, found in the asylum a tool to enforce conformity under the guise of care, seeds of a surgical future. As crude as these methods were, they planted a dangerous seed, the belief that madness could be subdued by force upon the body. If spinning chairs could shock calm into chaos, if ice baths could still agitation, perhaps deeper interventions could yield greater results. The leap from restraining the body to cutting into the brain was vast, yet the logic was already forming. By the late 19th century, with neurology advancing, physicians began to map behaviors to regions of the brain. Words, movements, emotions, all seemed to have roots in gray matter, and if the brain was the root, then surgery upon it might be the cure. The asylum's failures did not extinguish hope. They fanned desperation into boldness. What chains and baths could not achieve, perhaps the scalpel might. The ambiguity of mercy. To judge the past is easy, but one must imagine the context. Picture a physician standing in a ward of 50 screaming patients with only a handful of attendants. Picture a family tormented by the violent outbursts of a loved one pleading for relief. In their eyes, any method, however cruel, offered a glimmer of salvation. The line between mercy and violence blurred until it disappeared. Thus, the story of early treatments is not simply one of barbarism, it is also one of yearning, of a society desperate to relieve suffering, but trapped by ignorance. Every chain, every bath, every blade was wielded with the conviction, however misguided, that it might restore peace toward the knife. The silence that hung over the wards was deceptive. Beneath it pulsed an unspoken question. What if madness could be cut out like rot from an apple? Doctors whispered of experiments, of nerves and lobes, of the possibility of altering the mind through physical means. The asylum, crowded and restless, demanded solutions. Families demanded relief. Governments demanded order. All forces converged on one possibility: surgery. The chains of iron would one day be replaced by the glint of steel scalpels. The bruises of restraint would give way to scars on the temples. The madness that once echoed through halls would be met not with dungeons or spinning chairs, but with an incision, small and precise, yet devastating. The age of the lobotomy was drawing near. Reflection. When society confronts what it cannot understand, it often chooses control over compassion. The history of madness reminds us that fear can masquerade as mercy, and cruelty can be disguised as cure. What then is true healing: the silencing of chaos, or the listening to it? The human skull, hard as stone yet fragile as glass, has long been both shield and prison for the mind. Since the dawn of civilization, humanity has wrestled with a haunting question: when madness or pain strikes, can relief be found by opening the very vault that houses thought itself? Long before scalpels gleamed in sterile operating rooms, long before surgeons spoke of neurons and lobes, there was the sound of stone scraping against bone. Sparks of fire lit caves where healers drilled into skulls with sharpened flint, and with each act, humanity inched closer to the terrible idea that altering the mind meant cutting into the brain. The oldest wound. Archaeology reveals that trepanation, boring or cutting holes into the skull, was practiced in societies stretching from ancient Peru to Neolithic Europe. Skulls thousands of years old bear round, deliberate openings, their edges smoothed by healing bone. Some patients lived for years after the procedure. The purpose? It remains cloaked in mystery. Some scholars believe it was spiritual, releasing demons, allowing evil spirits to escape through bone. Others argue it was medicinal, relieving pressure after head trauma or seizures. Perhaps it was both. The line between medicine and magic was thin in ancient worlds, and the human brain was a frontier of awe and terror. Imagine a healer, crouched in torchlight, scraping into the head of a trembling patient. The crowd watches in silence, breath held, as bone dust falls like snow. Whether in hope of banishing madness or easing suffering, the act itself signaled something revolutionary: the belief that the skull could be breached and life might continue. The Greeks and the humors. By the time of Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE, trepanation had entered the vocabulary of medicine. The brain, Hippocrates wrote, was the seat of intelligence, a radical departure from cultures that had centered the soul in the heart. Yet his remedies still blended science with superstition. Madness and melancholy were explained through imbalances of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Trepanation was used sparingly, but it persisted, particularly for head injuries. The act revealed both courage and ignorance. Surgeons sought to relieve pressure, not yet knowing of neurons or lobes, but sensing that inside the skull lay the key to suffering and its relief. The idea that madness might also be alleviated through intervention was already germinating. Rome and the surgical tradition. Roman physicians, inheriting Greek knowledge, refined surgical tools of bronze and iron. Galen, the great medical authority of the empire, dissected animal brains and speculated on the functions of different regions. Though human dissection was forbidden, his theories would dominate for over a millennium. Craniotomies controlled openings of the skull were attempted for trauma, abscesses, and infections. The procedures were brutal, survival uncertain, yet the persistence of the practice suggests that some did live. The motif of opening the head to heal endured across centuries, carried like an ember through the dark ages of medical knowledge. Medieval shadows. In medieval Europe, surgical practice stagnated under the weight of religious doctrine. Madness was again branded demonic, treated with prayer and exorcism rather than scalpels. Yet, trepanation never disappeared. Folk healers and barber surgeons continued the practice, crude and bloody, scraping bone with primitive drills. The Church condemned such interventions, but desperation often overpowered doctrine. Patients with seizures or hallucinations were sometimes subjected to the infamous stone of madness operation, a symbolic removal of an imaginary stone said to cause insanity. Satirical paintings from the Renaissance depict surgeons extracting pebbles from the skulls of wide-eyed patients, art that mocked both medicine and credulity. Yet behind satire lay truth. People did seek relief from madness through the knife. The Renaissance awakening. By the 16th century, anatomy was reborn. Vesalius, with his groundbreaking work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, mapped the human body in exquisite detail. Dissections revealed the brain as a complex, layered organ. The skull, once a sacred barrier, became a subject of scientific curiosity. Trepanation and craniotomy gained legitimacy once more. Surgeons developed hand-cranked drills, saws, and forceps. The operations were still perilous without anesthesia, without antisepsis, but survival was increasingly possible, and each operation, however crude, reinforced a dangerous conviction. The brain could be entered, manipulated, and perhaps healed. Enlightenment experiments. The 18th century brought electricity into the theater of the brain. Luigi Galvani's experiments with frog legs twitching under sparks suggested that life itself was electrical. If nerves responded to current, what of the brain? Soon, scientists speculated about stimulating or calming madness with shocks. Meanwhile, surgeons refined craniotomy for injuries. Reports of soldiers surviving head wounds spurred more daring interventions. Trepanation became a battlefield skill, and within asylums whispers grew louder. If trauma could be relieved by opening the skull, could the storms of madness be likewise soothed? The seed of neurosurgery. By the 19th century, neurology was a blossoming science. Paul Broca identified the region of the brain tied to speech. Carl Wernicke mapped comprehension. Localized function was no longer theory, but fact. Suddenly, the brain seemed a mosaic of specialized areas. If words resided in one lobe, if vision in another, then might not madness be rooted somewhere too? This realization changed everything. For centuries, trepanation had been ritual and guesswork. Now it hinted at precision. If the right piece of cortex could be targeted, perhaps behavior itself could be altered. The old act of scraping bone took on new meaning. It was no longer just about relieving pressure. It was about reshaping the self, a dark horizon. The journey from trepanation to lobotomy was not linear, but the echoes are clear. The persistence of opening the skull across cultures suggested an enduring belief. The key to the mind lay beneath bone. Ancient healers sought demons. Renaissance surgeons sought balance. Enlightenment scientists sought nerves and electricity. All marched toward the same abyss, the conviction that the mind could be cut, reshaped, controlled. In this sense, lobotomy was not a sudden aberration but a culmination. The scalpel's shadow stretched backward across millennia, tracing its lineage through every skull that had ever been pierced in hope of healing. The weight of legacy. It is tempting to dismiss trepanation as primitive, but it reveals something profound. Humanity has always been unwilling to surrender, to despair. In every age, people dared to cut into the skull of another human being, not from malice, but from conviction that life might be restored. That conviction would one day give birth to lobotomy, a practice far more precise in technique and infinitely more devastating in consequence. The scalpel did not appear suddenly in the hands of Walter Freeman. It was carried forward by thousands of unnamed healers, surgeons, and dreamers who believed that madness could be mastered if only the skull were breached. Reflection: every hole carved into a skull, from the stone tools of Neolithic shamans to the iron drills of Renaissance surgeons, carried the same question: is suffering an enemy that can be cut away, or a mystery to be endured? The persistence of trepanation whispers an uncomfortable truth, that hope can justify even the most dangerous of wounds. The room smelled faintly of ether and ink. In Lisbon, 1935, Antonio Agas Moniz leaned over his notes with a surgeon's intensity and a philosopher's obsession. Outside, the world reeled from the shadow of the Great War and the collapse of economies. Inside the hospital, another war raged, a war against the enigmas of the human mind. Patients whispered to unseen figures, clawed at invisible terrors, or sat in catatonic silence, unreachable. The asylums were bursting, corridors lined with beds where orderlies moved like ghosts. Treatments had failed: rest cures, hydrotherapy, sedatives. The brain remained an uncharted territory, and Moniz, restless and brilliant, dared to imagine it as a map that could be redrawn. Was it arrogance, or was it hope? Perhaps it was both. The man behind the scalpel. Antonio Caetano de Abreu Freire Agas Moniz was not merely a surgeon. He was a politician, a writer, a man of ambition, who carried himself with the gravitas of one who expected history to remember him. Born in 1874, Moniz had already achieved recognition in neurology. He studied the vascular system of the brain, inventing cerebral angiography, a method to visualize blood vessels. He knew the brain not as a mystical seat of the soul, but as a living organ of flesh, vessels, and matter. Yet even for him, madness remained a puzzle unsolved. In his lectures, he described the mentally ill as fixed in thought, their brains locked into pathological circuits. If those circuits could be broken, could the mind be freed? The idea seemed radical, but it was not without precedent. The spark. In 1935, Moniz attended a conference in London where he heard of experiments by Yale researchers John Fulton and Carlisle Jacobson. They had performed frontal lobe surgeries on chimpanzees, observing that once aggressive animals became calmer, more manageable. To many, this was a curiosity. To Moniz, it was revelation. If violence could be quelled in a chimpanzee by altering the frontal lobes, why not in humans tormented by obsession, paranoia, or hallucination? The frontal lobes, seat of judgment and personality, might also be the roots of madness, and if those roots could be cut, perhaps new growth could emerge. The seed of the lobotomy was planted in that moment, half science, half desperation, wholly transformative. The first leucotomies. Returning to Lisbon, Moniz began his experiments. With neurosurgeon Almeida Lima, he developed a procedure called the leucotomy. The technique was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Holes were drilled into the skull, and alcohol was injected to destroy white matter in the frontal lobes. Later, he refined the method, using a surgical instrument, essentially a wire loop, to sever brain connections more directly. The first operations were performed in 1935. The results were mixed, ambiguous, but to Moniz, they glowed with promise. Some patients, previously tormented by hallucinations, grew calmer. Others, once violent, sat quietly. Families reported relief. Doctors proclaimed progress. Of the failures and tragedies, patients who became vacant, incontinent, or died, Moniz spoke less. For him, the breakthrough outweighed the cost. The language of salvation. Moniz wrote of his procedure with evangelical zeal. He argued that mental illness was not a moral failing, but a biological disease, one that could be treated surgically like a tumor. In his words, lobotomy was not mutilation, but liberation, an unlocking of the brain's prison. To a world drowning in asylum, overcrowding, his message was irresistible. Newspapers hailed him as a pioneer. Hospitals across Europe took notice. For families who had watched loved ones scream, starve, or rot in institutions, the idea of a cure, even at great risk, was a lifeline. Hope, however, is a dangerous anesthetic. The Nobel Prize. In 1949, Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his discovery of the therapeutic value of prefrontal leucotomy. The accolade cemented his legacy, granting legitimacy to a practice that was already spreading across continents. Yet controversy swirled even then. Many argued that his evidence was thin, his trials rushed, his reports selective. He had operated on a small number of patients, and long-term outcomes were poorly documented. Critics charged that he had mistaken silence for healing, docility for recovery. But the Nobel Prize silenced many doubts. Authority had spoken, and history, it seemed, had chosen its hero. Shadows of ambition. Moniz himself would not live to see the full consequences of his discovery. In 1939, he was shot by a former patient, left partially paralyzed, and thereafter confined to a wheelchair. Yet he continued to defend his work, convinced to the end that lobotomy was a triumph of modern medicine. But was Moniz a visionary or a cautionary tale? His procedure was born of ambition, yes, but also of genuine compassion for the suffering he could not otherwise reach. The line between healer and transgressor blurred in his steady hand. History, like the scalpel, would cut both ways. The world takes notice. From Lisbon, the leucotomy traveled swiftly. British doctors adopted it. Scandinavian countries followed. Across the Atlantic, a brash and charismatic American named Walter Freeman would seize upon Moniz's idea and carry it further, faster, bolder, and with devastating reach. The story of lobotomy was no longer confined to a Portuguese laboratory. It was becoming a global phenomenon, a fire spreading from ward to ward, nation to nation. And, like all fires, it would burn both light and shadow. A question unanswered. Moniz's spark was both a beginning and an omen. The scalpel had opened a path into the most intimate sanctum of humanity. The frontal lobes, the seat of identity. Once opened, that path could never be closed. What does it mean to heal, if healing comes at the cost of the self? Moniz did not ask this question. Or perhaps he asked it silently, and buried it beneath ambition. Yet it lingers, echoing across decades. Is the silencing of madness salvation, or is it erasure? Reflection. The story of Moniz reminds us that progress is often born not in certainty but in desperation. The same spark that lights the way forward may also set the future ablaze. In every age, we must ask, when does healing end and hubris begin? The operating theater was silent, save for the faint hum of electric lights and the rhythmic clink of metal on metal. A patient lay motionless on the table, eyes closed under the haze of anesthesia. Beside him stood two men, Walter Freeman, the flamboyant showman of psychiatry, and James Watts, his more cautious surgical partner. Together, they prepared to perform what would soon become the most infamous procedure in the history of American medicine, the lobotomy. It began with a drill, a scalpel, and an idea borrowed from Lisbon. Yet, in their hands, the leucotomy would be reshaped, popularized, and carried into the heart of American hospitals, transforming from experimental surgery into a crusade. Walter Freeman, the evangelist of the knife. Walter Jackson Freeman II was not a surgeon but a neurologist, a man with a taste for drama and an unshakable confidence in his own genius. Born into a family of physicians, he carried himself with an air of destiny. Freeman loved theatrics. He performed surgeries with flourish, invited journalists into operating rooms, and posed proudly beside his patients for photographs. He was captivated by Moniz's work. Where others saw uncertainty, Freeman saw salvation. America's asylums were bursting with the mentally ill tens of thousands warehoused in misery. Freeman believed lobotomy could unlock their chains, free their families, and revolutionize psychiatry. He was not merely adopting a procedure, he was crafting a movement. James Watts, the steady hand. But Freeman needed a surgeon. James Watts, a neurosurgeon of calm temperament and precise skill, became his partner. Where Freeman provided charisma, Watts offered discipline. Their partnership was uneasy. Watts wary of Freeman's flamboyance, Freeman impatient with Watts's caution. Yet together they made history. In 1936, the pair performed the first prefrontal lobotomy in the United States, drilling holes into the skull and severing white matter in the frontal lobes. Freeman proclaimed success. The patient, once tormented by depression, was quieter, calmer. Families wept with relief. A spark ignited. The early crusade. Freeman and Watts launched into their work with zeal. They operated on patients with schizophrenia, depression, mania, and obsessive behaviors. Hospitals, desperate for relief from overcrowding, welcomed them. Families pleaded for their services. By the early 1942nd, lobotomies were spreading rapidly. The results were ambiguous but seductive. Some patients did improve, at least superficially. They were quieter, more manageable. In an asylum drowning in chaos, a single quiet ward felt like a miracle. Doctors praised the procedure as a breakthrough. Newspapers hailed it as hope, and Freeman basked in the spotlight. Yet for every story of recovery, there were stories of devastation. Some patients emerged apathetic, stripped of ambition and personality. Others were left incontinent, disoriented, or worse, dead. Freeman, however, brushed aside criticism. He was convinced that the benefits outweighed the costs. The ice-pick revelation. Freeman was not content with drills and surgical theaters. He dreamed of a procedure so simple, so quick, that any psychiatrist might perform it even without a surgeon's training. He found his inspiration in the ordinary ice-pick. In 1945, Freeman devised the transorbital lobotomy. Instead of drilling into the skull, He inserted a sharp instrument through the patient's eye socket, hammering it with a mallet to pierce the thin bone behind the eye. With a sweep of his wrist, he severed connections in the frontal lobes. The entire procedure took minutes. No operating room was required. No neurosurgeon needed. Freeman could perform it in his office, in mental hospitals, even in kitchens. And he did. The showman surgeon. Freeman's performances became legend. He carried his instruments in a leather case, traveling from hospital to hospital like a missionary of silence. In front of crowds of doctors and nurses, he performed lobotomies with a flourish, sometimes two in a single session. He timed himself for speed. He photographed patients before and after, presenting their docility as evidence of cure. The press adored him. Families desperate for relief saw him as a savior. The number of lobotomies soared. By the late 1942nd thousands had undergone the procedure in America, from housewives to veterans of World War II. Freeman was hailed as a pioneer, a man unafraid to challenge convention in the name of progress. But shadows lengthened behind the stage lights. Watts's departure. James Watts grew increasingly disturbed. He had joined Freeman to bring surgical precision to a daring idea, but Freeman's ice-pick lobotomies horrified him. Watts believed medicine demanded rigor, sterility, discipline. Freeman's office procedures looked reckless, even barbaric. Their partnership fractured. Watts withdrew, leaving Freeman to march forward alone, unchecked. The break between them symbolized the divide within medicine itself, between those who believed in cautious science and those swept up by the fervor of a crusade. Lives transformed, lives erased. For the patient's outcomes were roulette wheel. Some did find relief, their anxieties diminished, their rages soothed, but countless others paid an unthinkable price. Personalities flattened, ambitions extinguished, emotions dulled to embers. Some families rejoiced at newfound calm. Others grieved the loss of the vibrant souls they once knew. The motif of silence grew heavier. Where once there had been screams and storms of madness, now there was quiet, but it was the quiet of absence, of vacancy. Was this healing, or was it annihilation? The evangelist unchecked. Freeman, emboldened by fame, dismissed critics as narrow-minded. He believed lobotomy could be applied broadly to depression, psychosis, chronic pain, even unruly children. He spoke of a future where society's ills could be cured with a swift stroke behind the eye. He became not merely a doctor but a prophet, promising salvation through steel. And America, in its desperation, listened, shadows gathering. Yet already, in whispers, doubt was spreading. Some doctors questioned the ethics, some families mourned the hollow shells left behind, and in the laboratories a new competitor was stirring psychiatric drugs, pills that promised relief without knives or hammers. Freeman could not see it yet. To him the ice-pick gleamed with destiny. The scalpel's shadow stretched across America, promising light but leaving darkness in its wake. Reflection. Freeman's story reminds us of the peril of charisma without restraint. Healing demands not only courage but humility. To wield a knife against the soul is to walk a path lined with shadows. The question remains, when does hope become hubris? And when does salvation become destruction? The late 1942nd unfolded like a fever dream. America, triumphant from war yet shaken by its cost, turned inward to face another battlefield, the human mind. Veterans returned from Europe and the Pacific, carrying invisible wounds, nightmares, tremors, uncontrollable rages. Families, once whole, found themselves fractured by unspoken trauma. Asylums, already overcrowded, groaned under the flood of new patients. Desperation hung in the air like smoke. Into this atmosphere surged the promise of lobotomy, gleaming like a silver key to the locked chambers of madness. Freeman and his followers presented it not as experiment, but as cure, not as risk, but as salvation. For a brief burning moment, the lobotomy became a symbol of hope, a procedure that seemed to offer peace where chaos reigned. A nation in need. By the mid-20th century, state hospitals in America were bursting at the seams. Hundreds of thousands languished behind barred windows, some for decades. Treatments were primitive, sedatives, restraints, and electroconvulsive therapy delivered with little precision. Families who could no longer cope sent loved ones into these institutions, clinging to the faint hope of recovery. The introduction of lobotomy was a revelation. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle. Magazines carried glowing features with photographs of patients before and after. Doctors described the once violent becoming docile, the restless becoming calm. Families read these accounts and flooded hospitals with requests. The tide of public opinion swelled in favor. In a country yearning for order, the lobotomy seemed to offer not just medical progress, but social harmony. Freeman on the road. Walter Freeman became a man possessed. With his ice pick instruments stored in a leather case, he nicknamed his Lobotomobile. He crisscrossed the United States, performing demonstrations in hospitals, large and small. He was more evangelist than doctor, a traveling prophet of psychiatry. In packed auditoriums, he would stride onto the stage, pick in hand, and drive the thin shaft through an eye socket with theatrical flourish. Assistants held their breath as he tapped the mallet, then swept the instrument side to side, severing connections in the frontal lobes. Minutes later, the patient would be wheeled away, and Freeman would beam at the crowd, declaring another victory over madness. His charisma was infectious. Young psychiatrists, eager for innovation, idolized him. Administrators, overwhelmed by asylum costs, welcomed him. Families, desperate for relief, begged for his services. Lobotomy became not just a medical procedure, but a cultural phenomenon. Numbers rising. By the late 1942nd and early 1952nd, lobotomies were being performed by the tens of thousands. Estimates suggest that in the United States alone, over 40,000 people underwent the surgery. Worldwide, the number was far higher. Patients ranged from the profoundly ill to those suffering from depression or anxiety. Housewives unable to manage daily life, veterans haunted by war, children deemed unruly, all were considered candidates. The definition of who needed a lobotomy expanded with alarming speed. Hospitals embraced it as a solution to overcrowding. A ward of screaming, restless patients could be subdued in days. Order returned, quiet settled. To administrators, this was success. The public narrative. The press played its role in gilding the procedure. Photographs of smiling patients, now calm and obedient, were printed alongside glowing headlines. Surgery for the soul. New hope for the mentally ill. Freeman became a household name, his methods a point of fascination. The lobotomy's golden hour shone brightest in these stories, where suffering seemed to yield to science. It was, for a moment, the very embodiment of modern progress, a triumph of steel and will over chaos, the other side of silence. But behind the bright headlines, shadows deepened. The After photographs hid the truth that many patients were left vacant, stripped of ambition, emotion, and memory. Families at first relieved often grew horrified. Mothers who once sang to their children now stared blankly at the wall. Sons who had fought bravely now shuffled aimlessly through hallways. Some outcomes were catastrophic seizures, incontinence, even death. Yet statistics were manipulated, failures downplayed, critics silenced by the weight of public hope. In the silence that followed the hammer strike, doubt was easy to ignore. A culture of compliance. The lobotomy flourished, not only because of medical ambition, but because it fit the cultural climate. Post-war America prized conformity, stability, obedience. A procedure that erased defiance and quieted disorder aligned all too neatly with these values. Women who challenged domestic expectations, children who resisted authority, men who could not resume their roles as breadwinners. Lobotomy offered a way to render them manageable. The scalpel became a tool of social control, cloaked in the language of medicine. International reach. The golden hour extended beyond America. In Britain, Scandinavia, Japan, and the Soviet Union, surgeons adopted lobotomy with enthusiasm. Each country framed it through its own culture, sometimes as progressive, sometimes as pragmatic, but always as hopeful. Tens of thousands more were operated on, their lives forever altered. For a brief span of history, lobotomy seemed unstoppable, the fragile glow. Yet the very brightness of the lobotomy's golden hour concealed its fragility. Behind every smiling photograph was a shadowed room where families whispered of loss. Behind every glowing headline was a patient who would never again be whole. And in laboratories, the first whispers of chemical psychiatry were rising drugs that promised calm without the blade. The lobotomy's triumph was destined to be short-lived, but in this moment, it stood at its zenith, a procedure embraced by nations, blessed by headlines, and practiced with zeal. Reflection. Every golden hour carries within it the seeds of its decline. What shines as salvation today may be judged as tragedy tomorrow. The story of lobotomy's triumph forces us to ask, do we mistake silence for healing because it comforts us or because it truly cures? The headline spoke of miracles, of tormented minds soothed and families restored. Doctors spoke of progress, administrators of order. But beneath the statistics and the photographs lay the human cost, the faces, names, and voices of those who underwent the lobotomy. Some stepped forward willingly, volunteers seeking relief. Others were carried in by families or committed by institutions, offered no choice at all. Each became part of an experiment that would forever alter not only their brains, but their very identities. The scalpel may have silenced the storm of madness, but it also silenced songs, ambitions, laughter, and love. Here, the statistics dissolve, and we meet the lives hidden in their shadows, the willing seekers. Not all lobotomy patients resisted. Some sought it out, weary of relentless depression, crippling anxiety, or hallucinations that haunted them night and day. In the 1,942nd and 1,952nd, psychiatric wards were terrifying places, and alternatives were few. Electroshock therapy was violent, insulin comas dangerous, sedatives numbing but temporary. For many, the promise of lobotomy seemed like hope where none existed. Imagine a young woman, her hands trembling as she signs the papers. She has been told the procedure may free her from despair, allow her to return to her children, her husband, her work. She consents, clinging to the dream of normalcy. After the surgery, her panic subsides, but so too does her spark. She moves through her days quietly, cooking meals, folding laundry, but the laughter that once filled her home is gone. Her children grow up with a mother who is present in body, absent in spirit. This was the paradox of the volunteer. Relief came, but at the cost of self. The silent victims. Far more common were those who had no voice in the decision. Families overwhelmed by care signed consent forms. Hospitals, desperate to reduce chaos, ordered surgeries en masse. Patients who resisted were restrained, their pleas dismissed as symptoms of madness. Veterans haunted by war memories were marched into operating rooms, their heroism erased in a single strike of the mallet. Housewives deemed too anxious or rebellious were sent in by husbands or parents, their independence branded as illness. Children, as young as 12, underwent the procedure, their futures stolen before they had even begun. The silence of these victims is perhaps the most haunting. For them, the lobotomy was not chosen, it was imposed, a fate carved into the skull without consent. The case of the soldier. One story, repeated in the archives of veterans' hospitals, tells of a young man returned from World War II. Night after night, he woke screaming, convinced he was back in the trenches. His rage terrified his family. Doctors recommended a lobotomy. Afterward, the nightmare ceased. The family rejoiced. But the soldier, once full of life, now sat for hours staring at nothing, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He never worked again, never laughed again, never truly returned. Was this peace, or was it surrender? The child patient. In West Virginia, a 12-year-old boy was lobotomized for defiance and restlessness. His teachers had called him unmanageable. His parents, overwhelmed, agreed to the procedure. Afterward, he was quiet, compliant. But he never completed school, never held a job, never married. His childhood had been cut away with the sweep of an ice pick. Stories like his remind us that lobotomy was not confined to the severely ill. It reached into classrooms, households, and orphanages, where the line between illness and inconvenience blurred fatally. Women and the domestic cage. A striking number of lobotomy patients were women. Housewives struggling with depression, exhaustion, or dissatisfaction were prime candidates. In a culture that prized conformity and obedience, a woman who resisted her domestic role could easily be pathologized. Some emerged docile, their energy drained, their resistance quelled. Families spoke of improvement, but often what they meant was compliance. The scalpel became a tool not just of psychiatry but of social control, reinforcing the boundaries of gender and silence. Behind the rhetoric of healing, countless women's voices were muted, their independence carved away in the name of normalcy. The spark gone out. One of Freeman's favorite demonstrations was the before and after photograph. In the first, a patient's face twisted with anguish, eyes wide with terror. In the second, they sat calmly, smiling faintly. To Freeman, this was proof of success. To critics, it was proof of absence. For many families, the transformation was bittersweet. The storms were gone. Yes, but so were the songs. A father no longer raged, but no longer played with his children. A wife no longer wept, but no longer embraced. The essence of the person seemed to have vanished, leaving only a shadow. The roulette of outcomes. Not all lobotomies ended in ruin. Some patients did report lasting relief, living quieter lives and avoiding the asylum altogether. A few even expressed gratitude, claiming the surgery saved them from torment. But the unpredictability was staggering. Outcomes depended on the surgeon's skill, the extent of brain damage, and sheer chance. To undergo a lobotomy was to spin a wheel of fate. Some walked away calmer, some broken, some never walked again, and all bore the mark of a society willing to gamble with identity itself. The aftermath for families. For families, the impact was lifelong. Some rejoiced at the calm return of their loved one, clinging to the fragments of normalcy regained. Others lived with regret, haunted by the emptiness left behind. Parents grieved children who no longer dreamed. Spouses mourned partners who no longer loved. The lobotomy was not merely a surgery on the brain. It was a surgery on families, on communities, on futures. Its scars stretched far beyond the patients themselves. Voices that could not be heard. The most tragic element of these stories is the silence. Patients who might have told us what it felt like the moment of change, the loss of memory, the fading of self could not speak or were not believed. Their experiences vanished into institutional records, their identities folded into case studies. We know them only through fragments, photographs, medical notes, whispered family recollections. The voices themselves are gone, erased by the very procedure meant to heal. The shadow of consent, the tale of victims and volunteers is a reminder that medicine does not exist in isolation. It is shaped by culture, by power, by desperation. To call someone a volunteer when their choices are narrowed by suffering or coercion is to stretch the word beyond meaning. The scalpel did not simply cut brain tissue. It cut into the moral fabric of society, exposing how far people will go when confronted with suffering they cannot understand. Reflection. Every patient carried a story into the operating room. Few carried one out. Their lives remind us that healing without consent is not healing, and that silence, however calm, can never replace the music of a living soul. The story of the lobotomy might have remained confined to the shadowed halls of asylums and the whispered grief of forgotten families had it not touched one of America's most powerful dynasties. When the scalpel pierced the skull of Rosemary Kennedy, sister to a future president, the procedure leapt from medical journals and hospital wards into the public imagination. It revealed, with brutal clarity, that lobotomy was not merely a tool for the poor, the marginalized, or the voiceless. It could reach into the very heart of privilege, altering the fate of a family destined to shape a nation. Rosemary Kennedy, a life in shadow. Rosemary Kennedy was born in 1918, the third child of Joseph and Rose Kennedy. Unlike her brilliant brothers, whose names John, Robert, Edward would dominate American politics, Rosemary struggled from an early age. Developmentally delayed, she lagged behind in school, her speech halting, her coordination clumsy. In a family obsessed with achievement, Rosemary's differences were a source of anxiety and embarrassment. Yet photographs of her youth show a radiant girl, smiling brightly at dances, dressed in fine gowns. She was sent to elite schools, even presented at court in London, but beneath the polished exterior lay deeper troubles. Rosemary's moods were volatile, her frustrations explosive. She lashed out unpredictably, sometimes with violence. At night, she would slip away from the house, wandering the streets until found. For Joseph Kennedy, patriarch and political strategist, these behaviors were intolerable risks to the family's ambitions. The decision. By the early 1942nd, Rosemary was in her early 20s. Her difficulties had grown more pronounced, her independence elusive. Doctors advised the Kennedys that lobotomy, a new, promising procedure, might calm her mood swings and allow her to live more peacefully. For Joseph Kennedy, the choice seemed obvious. In 1941, without consulting the rest of the family in depth, Joseph authorized the operation. Rosemary was taken to George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C., where Walter Freeman and James Watts prepared to operate. The decision was made swiftly, almost clinically, as though her life were another element in Joseph's political calculus. The operation. The procedure was brutal in its simplicity. Holes were drilled into Rosemary's skull and sharp instruments inserted into her frontal lobes. As Freeman and Watts worked, they asked her to recite prayers, sing songs, and speak words cutting deeper each time her voice faltered. When she grew incoherent, the operation ended. Rosemary, once vivacious if troubled, was left incapacitated. Her speech reduced to fragments, her motor skills destroyed. She could no longer care for herself. The procedure that promised peace delivered devastation. The aftermath, the consequences were catastrophic. Rosemary, just 23 years old, was left with the mental capacity of a toddler. She spent the rest of her life in institutions, largely hidden from public view. The Kennedys, masters of image, shielded her from the spotlight. For decades, her condition was scarcely mentioned, her name absent from the family's glamorous narrative. Her siblings rarely saw her. Only in later years, after Joseph Kennedy's stroke, did the family, particularly Eunice Kennedy Shriver, reconnect with Rosemary, drawing inspiration from her tragedy to found the Special Olympics and advocate for the intellectually disabled. Rosemary's life, diminished by surgery, nonetheless sparked compassion and reform. A family's silence. The story of Rosemary Kennedy epitomized the silence that lobotomy imposed not just upon the patient, but upon families and societies. Her absence at the Kennedy table was unspoken, a shadow behind the brilliance of her brother's achievements. In public, the Kennedys projected vitality, charm, and intellect. In private, they bore the quiet grief of a daughter and sister lost not to illness, but to medicine itself. For Joseph Kennedy, the decision must have seemed rational, even merciful. Yet history judges differently. His choice to silence Rosemary, to prioritize family reputation over her dignity, reveals how power and stigma intertwine. Even privilege could not shield Rosemary from the scalpel's devastation. The symbol of Rosemary, Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy, transformed her into more than a private tragedy. She became a symbol, though often unacknowledged, of the dangers of unchecked medical ambition. If lobotomy could destroy a Kennedy, it could destroy anyone. Her story entered the cultural consciousness slowly, whispered first in medical circles, later in biographies and histories. When the truth emerged fully, it cast a harsh light on the lobotomy's legacy and on the willingness of families, even the most powerful, to sacrifice individuality for conformity. The broader impact, the Kennedy connection, did more than shock. It revealed the reach of lobotomy across class lines. It was not confined to the poor, the institutionalized, or the voiceless. Even the wealthy and influential, those with access to the best doctors, the most advanced knowledge, embraced it. That willingness lent the procedure legitimacy, convincing countless ordinary families that if the Kennedys endorsed it, it must be safe. Thus, Rosemary's fate, though hidden, indirectly encouraged others to step forward, to trust Freeman's scalpel. Her silence echoed beyond her own life, amplifying the reach of the lobotomy itself. The paradox of memory. In later decades, Rosemary became both forgotten and immortalized. Forgotten in the sense that her family rarely spoke of her, her presence erased from official narratives. Immortalized in that her tragedy helped ignite movements for disability rights, her quiet endurance inspiring compassion in her surviving siblings. Her life asks us to confront uncomfortable questions. What is the worth of a human being when stripped of ambition and independence? Was Rosemary's calm after surgery truly peace, or merely vacancy? And what responsibility do families bear when choosing on behalf of those who cannot consent? The echo in culture. Rosemary Kennedy's story rippled outward, inspiring novels, plays, and biographies. In the public imagination, she became emblematic of lobotomy's cruelty. A vibrant young woman silenced, her life dimmed not by illness but by the arrogance of progress. Her shadow lingers in every depiction of lobotomy in literature, and film a reminder that behind the statistics are individuals whose stories can never be reclaimed. Reflection. The tale of Rosemary Kennedy reminds us that tragedy spares no one, not the poor, not the powerful. Her silence is both personal and universal, echoing the countless lives diminished by lobotomy. It asks us, in our pursuit of healing, do we sometimes sacrifice the very essence of the person we seek to save? The scalpel did not remain confined to hospitals or the desperate hands of families. Once governments and institutions discovered the lobotomy's ability to impose silence and order, it became a tool not just of medicine but of control. The state, ever eager to reduce costs, enforce discipline, and maintain stability, found in the lobotomy a grim ally. In the shadows of prisons, veterans' hospitals, and state-run asylums, the procedure expanded far beyond the realm of healing. It became an instrument of policy, a method of erasure. Veterans of war. The Second World War had left millions wounded in body and mind. Shell shock, now called post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested in trembling hands, sleepless nights, and unending visions of battle. America's Veterans Administration hospitals overflowed with men who had once stormed beaches and liberated cities, but now lived imprisoned by memory. For administrators drowning in cases, lobotomy appeared as salvation. Thousands of veterans underwent the procedure, their restless nights and violent outbursts replaced by docility. To families, it seemed a relief. To the government, it was efficient. Yet beneath the surface lay tragedy. Soldiers who had once fought bravely were stripped of vitality, their courage transmuted into passivity. The state, which had once celebrated their valor, now sanctioned their silence. The irony was bitter. Men who had defended freedom lost their own minds to a surgeon's blade. Prisons and punishment. In penitentiaries, the lobotomy took on a darker cast. Prisoners considered dangerous or uncontrollable were selected for the procedure. Some were offered it as a treatment, others as a path to parole. In reality, it was a means to subdue. A violent inmate, once lobotomized, became compliant. A rebel became quiet. The knife transformed punishment into medical justification. Though records are often scarce, testimonies reveal that in several states, lobotomy was wielded as a disciplinary weapon. Consent was dubious, often coerced. Inmates desperate for freedom accepted the surgery, only to emerge diminished, their defiance gone. The prison system, always a mirror of society's harshest instincts, embraced the lobotomy as a shortcut to order. The marginalized and forgotten. The reach of the lobotomy extended far beyond hospitals and prisons. Those on the margins, orphans, the poor, the disabled, were disproportionately subjected to it. State institutions housing children with developmental delays or women deemed immoral saw lobotomy as a solution to unruliness. Girls who resisted authority, who fled orphanages or spoke too boldly, were candidates. The scalpel was presented as care but functioned as correction. Boys judged defiant, men labeled drifters, women marked hysterical, all were silenced beneath the guise of treatment. Here, lobotomy revealed its darkest truth. It was never only about madness. It was about control, about bending individuals to the will of families, institutions, and governments that found their behavior inconvenient. International shadows. The state's embrace of lobotomy was not confined to America. In the Soviet Union, lobotomy was debated as a tool for controlling dissidents and unruly patients. In Scandinavia, thousands were subjected to it under state programs, particularly women deemed unfit for motherhood. In Japan, it became a quiet method for managing institutionalized patients. Everywhere, the justification was the same: order, efficiency, the illusion of mercy. But beneath it all lay the same philosophy that the state could carve away disorder, not only from society but from the brain itself. Freeman and the state. Walter Freeman himself often courted institutional power. He presented his procedures to government officials, arguing that lobotomy could reduce asylum costs and restore order to society. His rhetoric aligned perfectly with bureaucratic desires: fewer patients to manage, fewer outbursts to control, fewer dollars to spend. Freeman saw himself as liberator. The state saw him as convenient. Together they advanced a crusade that blurred the line between healing and governance. The illusion of consent. In these state-sponsored procedures, consent became a hollow word. How freely could a prisoner choose, knowing refusal meant years behind bars? How freely could a veteran agree when haunted by memories and pressured by doctors? How freely could a child in an orphanage or a woman confined to an asylum give permission? The scalpel moved forward regardless. Consent became paperwork, signatures obtained in haste or under coercion. The state, cloaked in authority, turned individual bodies into canvases for its policies. Silence as social policy. What united these cases was not medicine, but silence. Lobotomy quieted veterans who raged against nightmares, prisoners who resisted, women who defied, children who rebelled. Silence was the outcome sought by both families and governments. Silence became policy. The tragedy was not only the loss of lives, but the loss of voices. Voices that might have spoken truth about war, injustice, poverty, or abuse were instead extinguished in the stillness of brain damage. In this way, the lobotomy served not only psychiatry, but power, a shadowed legacy. As psychiatric drugs emerged in the 1952nd, governments gradually abandoned lobotomy. Pills were cheaper, easier, less visibly brutal. But the scars remained in the families who mourned altered loved ones, in the prisons that had weaponized surgery, in the veterans whose sacrifice was rewarded with erasure. The state's embrace of lobotomy stands as one of the most chilling chapters in medical history. It reveals how easily healing can become control, and how medicine, when wielded by power, can become a tool of oppression. Reflection. When the scalpel is guided by the hand of the state, it ceases to be merely a tool of healing and becomes an instrument of governance. The story of lobotomy's adoption by governments reminds us that silence, when imposed by power, is not peace, it is submission. The question lingers: how often does society confuse order with justice and silence with healing? The scalpel gleamed under the sterile lights, poised above the most delicate structure in existence, the human brain. Surgeons spoke of precision, of progress, of salvation. Yet, in the silence that followed the strike of the mallet or the sweep of the Lobotomy, one question loomed larger than all others. Was this science or hubris? Medicine has always straddled a paradox. To heal requires courage. To innovate requires daring. But when does daring become arrogance? And when does courage blur into cruelty? The story of lobotomy is not only a chronicle of procedures and patience, it is a mirror reflecting this timeless tension between the quest for knowledge and the limits of human dignity. The promise of science. To many doctors of the 1932nd and 1942nd, lobotomy was not madness but logic. Theories of brain localization suggested that thoughts and emotions resided in distinct regions. If destructive thoughts could be linked to the frontal lobes, then severing those connections might liberate the patient. It was, in its own way, a rational leap. Egas Moniz spoke of fixed circuits in the brain that trapped patients in pathological thought patterns. Walter Freeman described lobotomy as a method to cut away anxiety. Their language was scientific, framed in terms of experiments, hypotheses, and results. In journals, they cited percentages of improvement, catalogued case studies, and spoke with the authority of pioneers. For a world drowning in asylum overcrowding, these reports offered a lifeline. Science had finally found a way to transform chaos into calm, or so it seemed. The seduction of numbers. But behind the charts and statistics lurked ambiguity. What counted as improvement? Was a patient better because they no longer screamed, or worse because they no longer dreamed? Freeman claimed successes in 60, 70, even 80% of cases, yet his criteria were vague, often equating docility with cure. Families desperate for relief agreed. Hospitals seeking order agreed. Numbers became proof, and proof became progress. But the numbers did not measure humanity. They measured silence. Science, in its hunger for certainty, sometimes mistakes absence for healing. The mask of compassion. Lobotomy was not born of malice. Moniz, Freeman, Watts, and countless others genuinely sought to alleviate suffering. They faced wards filled with despair, patients who clawed at walls, families weeping in helplessness. In their eyes, inaction was cruelty. To try, however risky, was an act of compassion. And yet compassion, unchecked by humility, can become dangerous. To believe that one can cut into the essence of identity and emerge with healing requires more than skill. It requires the audacity to assume mastery over the soul. In this sense, lobotomy revealed not only compassion but hubris, the spectacle of progress. Science thrives not only in laboratories but in the theater of society. Freeman's dramatic demonstrations, the glowing headlines, the Nobel Prize awarded to Moniz, these spectacles fueled the lobotomy's rise. Progress became performance, and performance demanded results. In such a climate, doubt was inconvenient. Failures were minimized, complications obscured, and critics silenced. The aura of scientific triumph blinded many to the reality of suffering behind the stage lights. Was this science, or was it theater, dressed in the robes of medicine? The philosophy of limits. The story of lobotomy forces us to confront an eternal question. Should science pursue every path it can conceive? To cut into the brain is to touch the very seat of memory, desire, and self. Unlike amputating a limb or excising a tumor, altering the mind transforms the essence of who a person is. Philosophers have long warned of the dangers of overreach. The Greeks told of Icarus soaring too high on wings of wax, undone by his own ambition. In lobotomy, we glimpse a modern Icarus medicine, soaring on the promise of progress, only to fall when ambition melted into tragedy. Patients as subjects. Another layer of hubris lay in the way patients were treated, not as individuals with voices and choices, but as subjects of experiment. Consent was thin, often absent. Vulnerable populations, the poor, women, minorities, prisoners, children bore the brunt of experimentation. To operate on them without their understanding was to assume that their humanity was secondary to science. In this, the lobotomy era exposed a cruel hierarchy. Some lives were seen as less worthy of dignity, more available for risk. Echoes in modern science. Though lobotomy is now condemned, its shadow lingers in modern debates. Deep brain stimulation, genetic editing, and psychopharmacology all raise similar questions. When we alter the brain, are we healing or are we reshaping identity? How do we distinguish between compassion and control, between science and hubris? The legacy of lobotomy warns us that progress without humility leads to devastation. It teaches that every innovation must be weighed not only against scientific promise, but against ethical boundaries. The line that was crossed. Lobotomy crossed a line that medicine should never have crossed. It transformed suffering into silence at the expense of identity. It offered families a calmer loved one, but often at the cost of the person they once knew. It promised healing, but delivered absence. To call this science is both true and incomplete. It was science, yes, in method and ambition, but it was also hubris, an overreach into mysteries too deep, too fragile, for a blade to solve. The mirror for our time. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of lobotomy is that those who practiced it were not villains in their own eyes. They were men of their age, convinced of their righteousness, praised by society, rewarded by authority. They believed they were healers, and perhaps they were, until healing demanded the sacrifice of humanity itself. The mirror they hold up to us is clear. In every age, we must guard against our own blind spots, our own willingness to confuse silence with peace, absence with cure. Reflection. The question remains, was lobotomy science or hubris? The answer is both. It was born of knowledge and ambition, compassion and arrogance. Its story reminds us that progress, untempered by humility, becomes destruction. And it asks us, in this age of new frontiers, are we wiser now, or are we still building wings of wax? The golden hour of the lobotomy did not shine without shadows. Beneath the glowing headlines and triumphant press releases, whispers of doubt grew louder. Families mourned the losses they could not name. Doctors recorded complications they could not ignore. Journalists dug for truths buried beneath statistics. Slowly, the tide began to turn. What had been celebrated as salvation was now questioned as mutilation. The story of opposition to lobotomy is not one of sudden revolution, but of gradual awakening. It was the slow lifting of a veil, the dawning realization that silence was not healing, and vacancy was not peace. Families in mourning. For many families, the promise of lobotomy dissolved into grief. A mother, once lively and affectionate, returned home calm but vacant. A son, once spirited and ambitious, emerged, subdued, shuffling, his personality erased. Relief gave way to regret. Some spoke openly, demanding accountability. Others buried their sorrow in silence, ashamed that they had consented. Letters began to appear in medical journals, testimonials from relatives who felt betrayed. In kitchens and parlors across America, doubt took root. The stories rarely reached the newspapers that had once heralded Freeman as a savior, but within families, the truth was undeniable. Something precious had been lost, and it could not be recovered. Voices in the medical community, even among doctors, opposition stirred. Some psychiatrists and neurologists doubted the science behind Freeman's claims. They questioned the criteria of success, noting that calmness did not equal cure. Case studies revealed high rates of complications, seizures, paralysis, even death. The long-term outcomes, when tracked, were grim. Patients often remained disabled, institutionalized, or socially isolated. The surgical community, too, raised concerns. Freeman's flamboyant ice pick method horrified many neurosurgeons who viewed it as reckless and unprofessional. James Watts, once Freeman's partner, publicly distanced himself, condemning the procedure's indiscriminate use. Yet critics faced resistance. Freeman's charisma, the press's adoration, and the desperation of families made him untouchable for a time. Still, the cracks in his edifice of authority widened with every failed patient. Journalism's awakening. The press, once complicit in Freeman's rise, began to reconsider. Investigative reporters uncovered stories of devastation, patients reduced to shadows, families destroyed. Sensational pieces shifted tone from miracle cure to controversial surgery. Freeman's showmanship, once admired, became a liability. His traveling lobotomy demonstrations, with their theatrical hammer strikes, began to look less like science and more like spectacle. The turning point came when high-profile failures surfaced. The tragedy of Rosemary Kennedy was quietly known among journalists, though not fully revealed until later. Other cases, prominent figures reduced to silence, began to trickle into public awareness. The press could no longer ignore what families whispered in grief. Legal and ethical concerns. In the late 1942nd and 1952nd, questions of consent reached the courts. Could patients, especially children, prisoners, or the institutionalized, truly agree to such a procedure? Lawsuits emerged, though often quietly settled. Advocacy groups for the mentally ill began to call for greater scrutiny. Medical ethics, still a fledgling field, began to sharpen its teeth. The horrors of Nazi experiments, revealed during the Nuremberg trials, forced the world to reconsider medical authority and patient rights. Against this backdrop, the lobotomy appeared increasingly suspect. Was it treatment, or was it experimentation upon the vulnerable? The rise of rival therapies. Doubt gained strength as alternatives emerged. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, though controversial, seemed safer and more reversible, and in the early 1952nd, a revolution arrived in the form of chlorpromazine, better known as thorazine. This new psychiatric drug calmed agitation without surgery, dulled hallucinations without scalpels. Compared to the brutal permanence of lobotomy, a pill seemed merciful. The pharmaceutical age dawned just as the surgical age waned. Lobotomy, once hailed as the future, began to look like a relic. Freeman under fire. Walter Freeman, ever the evangelist, did not retreat. He doubled down, performing lobotomies by the hundreds, defending his legacy with charisma and stubbornness. But, as opposition mounted, his reputation frayed. Colleagues mocked his theatrics, hospitals began refusing him privileges, and newspapers turned skeptical. Tragedy struck in 1967, when a patient died on his operating table during her third lobotomy. Freeman's career effectively ended. He retreated into obscurity, driving his van across America to visit former patients, still convinced he had been right. The world, however, was moving on. The persistence of doubt. By the 1962nd, lobotomy was no longer celebrated. It was debated, criticized, increasingly condemned. Freeman's flamboyance, once his greatest asset, became proof of his recklessness. Moniz's Nobel Prize, once a triumph, became a bitter reminder of medicine's fallibility. Yet, the procedure did not vanish overnight. In some hospitals, lobotomies continued quietly, performed on patients deemed incurable. It lingered in the shadows, its legacy not easily erased. Opposition had grown, but the scars remained. The human cost of delay. The rise of opposition reveals a haunting truth. Countless lives were altered before doubt gained enough strength to stop the blade. Every patient who emerged vacant, every family who mourned, was part of the price paid for society's slow awakening. The momentum of hope, once set in motion, was not easily stopped. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson. Progress is not halted by a single voice, but by many, gathering slowly until silence gives way to truth. Reflection. Opposition to lobotomy teaches us that truth emerges not in triumph but in persistence. It is the courage of families who speak, the patience of critics who question, the tenacity of journalists who uncover, that shifts the course of history. The question it leaves us is simple yet eternal. How many lives must be lost before doubt is strong enough to challenge power? The year was 1952, and in a laboratory in France, a quiet revolution was about to unfold. Unlike the clang of surgical tools or the theatrical hammer strike of Freeman's ice pick, this revolution made no sound. It came in the form of a pill, small, unassuming, yet destined to reshape psychiatry forever. Its name was chlorpromazine. The world would know it as Thorazine, and its arrival signaled the beginning of the end for the lobotomy. A different kind of cure. Chlorpromazine was first developed not as a psychiatric drug, but as an antihistamine. Its calming effects were noted by chance, a side effect that soon became its destiny. French doctors began experimenting with its use on patients suffering from psychosis, mania, and schizophrenia. To their astonishment, the results were profound. Patients once tormented by hallucinations grew calmer. Agitations diminished. Paranoia lessened. The wards, once filled with screaming and chaos, began to quiet. But unlike lobotomy, the quiet came not from destruction, but from modulation. The pill dulled extremes without permanently cutting away pieces of the brain. For the first time in history, doctors held in their hands a treatment that seemed both effective and reversible. The decline of the scalpel, Thorazine's arrival, struck lobotomy like a hammer blow. Families who once begged for surgery now asked for pills. Hospitals, eager for safer alternatives, embraced the drug. The pharmaceutical industry, sensing vast markets, poured resources into psychiatric medication. Within a decade, lobotomy rates plummeted. Surgeons who had once filled schedules with Freeman's method now found themselves sidelined. Administrators who had once celebrated the cost savings of lobotomy discovered that medication was cheaper, less invasive, and politically safer. The scalpel's shadow receded. A new era of psychiatry. The 1952nd and 1962nd became the age of psychopharmacology. Thorazine was followed by a flood of new drugs, antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers. Where lobotomy had once been hailed as surgery for the soul, pills now claimed the title of chemical straitjackets. The metaphor was telling. Medications restrained symptoms without destroying identity. Patients could be discharged from hospitals, return to families, and even hold jobs. For institutions groaning under the weight of overcrowding, this was nothing short of miraculous. The asylum began to empty. Psychiatry was reborn, not as a surgical discipline, but as a chemical one. The double-edged sword. Yet, even as Thorazine saved patients from the scalpel, it introduced its own shadows. The drug did not cure psychosis. It suppressed it. Side effects were severe: tremors, rigidity, restlessness, facial tics. Long-term use led to tardive dyskinesia, a condition of uncontrollable movements. Patients often described feeling dulled, numbed, as though their emotions were muffled behind a chemical fog. The quiet was not always peace. It was sometimes sedation, a forced compliance. The ethical dilemmas that haunted lobotomy did not vanish. They simply changed form. Still, compared to the brutal permanence of lobotomy, Thorazine felt merciful. Freeman's resistance. Walter Freeman, ever the showman, resisted the chemical tide. He dismissed Thorazine as a crutch, claiming it only masked symptoms while lobotomy offered permanent cure. He continued his crusade well into the 1962nd, driving his lobotomobile across the country, performing operations in defiance of medical fashion. But the world had moved on. His audiences dwindled, his reputation tarnished. In the eyes of the profession, he became a relic, a tragic figure clinging to a past that chemistry had rendered obsolete. A shift in power. The rise of psychiatric drugs marked a profound shift in medical power. Where once surgeons had dominated, now pharmaceutical companies took the stage. Research dollars flowed toward chemical treatments. Governments invested in medications that could be mass-produced and widely distributed. Families, too, preferred pills to scalpels. Psychiatry itself was transformed. The psychiatrist, once part surgeon, part therapist, became primarily a prescriber. The human brain was no longer a structure to be cut, but a chemical system to be balanced. The asylum empties. Thorazine's impact extended beyond treatment. It fueled the movement of deinstitutionalization. With medications in hand, governments began closing state hospitals, arguing that patients could now live in the community. Beds emptied, wards closed, and the massive asylums that had once housed hundreds of thousands fell silent. For some patients, this was liberation, a chance to return home, to live with dignity. For others, it was abandonment. Community care often proved underfunded, leaving many adrift, untreated, homeless. The story of lobotomy's decline was intertwined with the complicated story of deinstitutionalization, freedom mixed with neglect, the shadow of comparison. As lobotomy faded into memory, it became a cautionary tale. Whenever psychiatric drugs were criticized for their side effects or overuse, defenders reminded the public, at least it is not lobotomy. The surgery became a ghost, haunting every discussion of psychiatric treatment, a reminder of how far medicine had strayed and how far it might stray again. The contrast was stark. Lobotomy had been irreversible. Thorazine, for all its flaws, could be stopped. Patients who disliked its effects could cease taking it, even if at the cost of relapse. In this reversibility lay hope, a philosophical shift. The rise of chemistry revealed something profound about humanity's relationship to the mind. Surgery had sought to cut out madness, to excise it like rot from fruit. Medication, by contrast, sought to calm madness, to coexist with it by altering chemistry. The shift was not only medical but philosophical, from conquest to management, from finality to balance. This shift asked new questions. If madness could be controlled by a pill, was it a disease of chemistry, a disorder of molecules? Was the self reducible to neurotransmitters? Could identity itself be tuned, like an instrument, by adjusting dosage? Where lobotomy had raised the specter of hubris, chemistry raised the specter of reductionism, the danger of seeing human beings as nothing more than chemical reactions. Reflection. The rise of Thorazine was both liberation and caution. It ended the reign of the scalpel, sparing countless lives from silence carved into bone. Yet it also taught us that every cure carries its shadows, and that even mercy can become a form of control. The lesson lingers. Healing is never only about quieting symptoms. It is about preserving the fullness of the human soul. The scalpel that once gleamed with promise now glinted with suspicion. By the 1962nd, lobotomy's golden hour had faded. What had been praised as miracle now looked like mutilation. Families whispered of ruin. Journalists exposed failures, and doctors who had once embraced the knife began to turn away. The silence that lobotomy imposed was no longer interpreted as healing. It was recognized as absence, as loss. And at the center of this unraveling stood Walter Freeman, the flamboyant crusader who had carried lobotomy across America. Once a hero, he was now becoming a pariah. The turning tide. The introduction of thorazine and other psychiatric drugs had already undercut Freeman's empire. Where once hospitals clamored for his services, they now leaned toward medication. The public mood shifted as stories of devastated patients emerged. No longer could Freeman rely on glowing headlines and admiring reporters. Journalists now asked sharper questions. What really happened to these patients? What price did they pay for their calm? Medical conferences, once eager to host his demonstrations, grew cold. His colleagues, embarrassed by his theatrics, distanced themselves. Freeman's reputation, built on charisma and confidence, began to crumble. A prophet without followers. Yet Freeman refused to surrender. He believed in lobotomy, with the zeal of a prophet, convinced that history would vindicate him. He continued to travel the country in his station wagon, his infamous lobotomobile, carrying his ice-pick instruments in a leather case. He visited hospitals still willing to allow him entry, performing operations with the same flourish that had once captivated audiences. But the crowds were gone. The admiration had turned to skepticism, the curiosity to revulsion. Freeman became a wandering relic of a fading age, clinging to a gospel the world no longer wished to hear. The third time. The tragedy that finally ended his career came in 1967. He operated on a woman who had already undergone 2 lobotomies under his hand. Believing another procedure might improve her condition, he performed a third. She hemorrhaged on the table and died. The death could not be hidden, could not be softened by statistics or rhetoric. Hospitals revoked his privileges. His career, built on thousands of incisions and endless miles of travel, was over. Freeman, once celebrated in newspapers and journals, was now cast aside, a symbol of reckless ambition. The ruins of a movement. By the late 1962nd, lobotomy was in steep decline. Psychiatric drugs offered safer, more effective alternatives. Legal and ethical scrutiny mounted, making it harder for surgeons to justify the procedure. The cultural mood had shifted. Conformity was no longer celebrated as peace, and individuality, once suppressed, was beginning to be valued again in the turbulent era of civil rights and counterculture. Lobotomy, with its aura of control and compliance, seemed grotesquely out of place in a society that was beginning to rebel against authority. The knife that had once promised order now symbolized oppression. Freeman's solitude. In his later years, Freeman lived quietly in California. He continued to visit his former patients, driving his van from state to state, keeping meticulous records. To him, they were his legacy, living proof of his life's work. He spoke to them with kindness, sometimes with pride, never admitting regret. Yet history had judged him otherwise. His patients were not symbols of triumph, but of tragedy. His career was not a story of healing, but of hubris. In his solitude, Freeman became a ghost of his own making, wandering among the very shadows he had carved into the minds of others. The cultural backlash. As lobotomy's reputation collapsed, it entered culture as a symbol of horror. Novels and films depicted it as a tool of control, a method of silencing inconvenient voices. In Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, published in 1962, the lobotomized figure of Randall McMurphy stood as a haunting metaphor for society's crushing of individuality. When the book was adapted into the 1975 film, the image of lobotomy burned itself into popular imagination as the ultimate act of dehumanization. What Freeman had once presented as mercy became universally recognized as mutilation, a legacy in fragments. The decline of lobotomy was not a single event, but a slow unraveling. Each tragedy, each failure, each new medication chipped away at its legitimacy. By the 1972nd, the procedure was nearly extinct in the West, remembered only as a cautionary tale. Yet the scars remained, not only on the foreheads of patients, but on the conscience of medicine. The medical community, once complicit, now sought to bury the memory, yet history would not allow it. The story of lobotomy became part of the broader reckoning with medical ethics in the 20th century, a reminder of how easily hope can blind, how quickly ambition can destroy. Shadows in the records. In dusty hospital archives, patient files remained. Names, age, diagnose, outcomes. Some were labeled improved, others unchanged. Still, others deceased. Behind each clinical note lay a human life, dreams altered, futures erased. Freeman's records, which he carried in his van, eventually became historical artifacts, studied by scholars as evidence of a dark chapter. Through these fragments we glimpse the enormity of the tragedy. Thousands of lives altered forever, each one a story silenced by the strike of steel. Reflection. The decline of lobotomy reminds us that truth, though delayed, will emerge. Silence cannot last forever. The scalpel that once glittered with promise became a symbol of arrogance, its champion reduced to solitude. The question lingers still. How many times must humanity stumble into darkness before it learns that not everything broken can or should be fixed by force? The lobotomy knife was sheathed, its era fading into memory, but the echoes of its cuts remained. Long after Freeman's van had ceased its journeys, and long after hospitals had abandoned the practice, the survivors of lobotomy lived on in the wards of institutions, in the care of families, in the shadows of society. They were living monuments to a medical experiment that had promised salvation and delivered silence. To walk through a psychiatric hospital in the 1972nd or 1982nd was to hear those echoes, the shuffling of feet, the murmurs of patients who no longer spoke in full sentences, the hollow laughter of those whose emotions had been blunted. The procedure was gone, but its ghosts lingered in every corridor. Survivors in silence. Tens of thousands of people survived their lobotomies. Many lived into old age, cared for in institutions or by relatives. Some found a degree of stability, no longer tormented by hallucinations or mania, but at the cost of vibrancy. Others were left profoundly disabled, unable to work, unable to live independently, their lives narrowed to routines of care. A woman once spirited and ambitious might spend decades folding towels in a hospital laundry. A man who once dreamed of being a writer might sit on a porch for hours, staring at the horizon, words forever lost to him. These survivors rarely told their own stories. They could not. Their experiences lived instead in the memories of those around them. Families in shadow. For families, the aftermath was bittersweet. Some clung to the relief that their loved one was no longer violent or tormented. Others grieved endlessly, haunted by what had been lost. A mother might whisper to her daughter's photograph, "She's still here, but she's not the same." A husband might sit beside his wife, now calm but vacant, wondering whether his desperation had betrayed her. The silence in households across America was profound. It was not the silence of peace, but of absence. Families who had once hoped for healing instead carried lifelong guilt. Institutions haunted. Hospitals, too, bore the weight of the past. In the 1972nd, as deinstitutionalization swept across the West, many state hospitals closed their doors. Abandoned buildings stood as decaying monuments, their walls etched with graffiti, their wards echoing with the memory of thousands of patients once confined within. In some of these crumbling structures, records of lobotomized patients were left behind, folders filled with names, diagnoses, and terse outcomes like improved, unimproved, deceased. Visitors to these ruins sometimes reported an uncanny sensation, as if the silence itself remembered. The ghosts of lobotomy were not spirits of superstition, but the very real lives erased by steel. The voices that remained. Not all survivors were voiceless. A few managed to tell their stories. Some spoke haltingly in interviews, describing the sensation of having their minds altered, their emotions dulled. Others expressed gratitude, claiming the surgery had spared them unbearable torment. These voices complicated the narrative, reminding us that even tragedy is not without nuance. Yet the majority remained silent, not by choice, but by consequence. Their absence in the historical record is as telling as any testimony. Silence became their biography. Artifacts of a dark age. In museums and archives today, one can find the instruments of lobotomy, Freeman's ice picks, Mona's leucotomes, faded photographs of patients before and after. These objects are unsettling in their ordinariness. The ice pick, once used to chip frozen water, became a weapon of neurosurgery. The leucotome, a loop of wire, looks almost benign. But to gaze upon them is to feel the weight of history pressing down, a reminder that cruelty often hides behind the guise of simplicity. For survivors who lived on in institutions, these artifacts were not history, but memory. Every tremor, every blank stare, every lost ambition was a living testament to the blade. The long shadow on psychiatry. The presence of lobotomy survivors shaped psychiatry for decades. Doctors, haunted by the mistakes of their predecessors, grew more cautious, more attuned to ethics. The rise of patient advocacy movements in the 1972nd and 1982nd was fueled in part by the legacy of lobotomy. Survivors, often hidden away, became symbols in debates over consent, dignity, and the limits of medical authority. In some countries, compensation was quietly offered to victims. In others, silence endured, the past too shameful to confront openly. But everywhere, the survivors themselves carried the burden. Memory and culture. The image of lobotomy survivors seeped into culture. Novels and films depicted vacant-eyed characters, robbed of passion and identity. Plays portrayed families grappling with the aftermath, torn between gratitude and grief. These cultural echoes gave voice to those who could not speak, turning silence into narrative, absence into metaphor. Yet for every fictionalized account, real survivors sat in institutions, unvisited, their lives reduced to shadows. Culture could dramatize their plight, but it could never return what had been lost. A healing that never came. The tragedy of lobotomy survivors lies in the gap between promise and reality. They entered the operating room with the hope of healing, carried by the desperation of their families. They emerged, altered, often beyond recognition. For decades afterward, they lived in a twilight existence, not ill enough to justify continued confinement, not well enough to live fully free. Healing never came, only endurance. Echoes that demand listening. The echoes of the asylum are not merely historical curiosities. They are moral demands. To listen to them is to confront the consequences of desperation, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the fragility of human dignity. Every survivor, whether known or unknown, reminds us that the pursuit of order can create greater disorder, that the quest for healing can deepen wounds. Their lives, though diminished, speak volumes. Reflection. The survivors of lobotomy remind us that history does not end when the scalpel is set aside. Its echoes linger in lives forever changed, in families forever grieving, in institutions forever haunted. The question their silence poses is one we cannot ignore. How do we honor those whose voices were taken from them in the name of healing? History is never confined to archives and hospitals. It bleeds into culture, reshaping how societies imagine themselves. The lobotomy, with its chilling imagery and devastating human cost, did not vanish into medical textbooks. It slipped into novels, films, plays, poetry, and public consciousness, transforming from procedure into metaphor. Where scalpels and ice picks once cut into brains, now words and images carved memory into collective imagination. The rise of the metaphor. By the 1962nd, as lobotomy's reputation crumbled, writers and artists seized upon it as a symbol. The word itself entered language as shorthand for numbness, compliance, and loss of individuality. To be lobotomized meant more than surgery. It meant erased, pacified, stripped of self. This shift from medical practice to cultural metaphor ensured that lobotomy would never truly fade. Even as fewer surgeries were performed, its ghost haunted conversations about conformity, power, and the dangers of progress unchecked. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. Perhaps the most influential portrayal of lobotomy appeared in Ken Kesey's 1962 novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Set in a psychiatric hospital, it pitted individuality against authoritarian control, embodied in the clash between Randall McMurphy and Nurse Ratched. When McMurphy is lobotomized after rebelling, his fate becomes the ultimate symbol of institutional oppression. The 1975 film adaptation starring Jack Nicholson cemented this imagery. The scene of McMurphy's return, his spirit gone, his body shuffling, seared itself into the public's mind. Lobotomy was no longer just a medical footnote. It was a cultural condemnation, a visual shorthand for the crushing of freedom and humanity. Through Kesey's story, lobotomy became mythologized as the price of defiance in a world obsessed with control. Lobotomy in theater and fiction. The stage, too, embraced lobotomy as metaphor. Tennessee Williams's Suddenly Last Summer, 1958, depicted a mother's attempt to have her niece lobotomized to suppress memories of her son's death and secrets. Here, lobotomy symbolized not healing, but erasure, a means to silence inconvenient truths. In literature, authors employed lobotomy to explore themes of conformity and alienation. Characters, described as lobotomized, populated novels and short stories, their vacant stares and dulled emotions, emblematic of modern disconnection. The surgery, once marketed as liberation, was recast as a weapon of suppression. The political metaphor, beyond art, lobotomy became a political metaphor. In speeches, essays, and journalism, critics of authoritarian regimes, corporate culture, and mass media invoked lobotomy to describe the pacification of populations. To be culturally lobotomized meant to be silenced by propaganda, dulled by consumerism, or stripped of individuality by conformity. The scalpel that once cut into brains now cut into language, carving a symbol that transcended medicine. Music and popular culture. Musicians, too, found in lobotomy a darkly resonant image. Punk bands of the 1972nd and 1982nd railed against conformity, shouting lyrics about being lobotomized by society. The Ramones' song Teenage Lobotomy mocked consumer culture's effect on youth, turning medical horror into satire. In popular films and television, lobotomy often appeared as shorthand for control or cruelty, a nurse's threat, a villain's punishment, a tragic character's fate. These references reinforce the procedure's association with loss of identity, memory in museums and exhibitions. As the 20th century drew to a close, museums began curating exhibits on psychiatry's darker chapters. Lobotomy instruments, Freeman's ice picks, Moniz's leucotomes were displayed in glass cases, chilling in their simplicity. Visitors stared at the objects and shivered, not because of their size or sharpness, but because of what they symbolized: the arrogance of progress, the fragility of the human soul. These exhibitions transformed lobotomy into cultural memory. No longer just history, it became a lesson, an artifact of caution, preserved for reflection. Survivors in stories. Some survivors, or their families, contributed to this cultural memory by sharing their experiences. Memoirs and documentaries emerged, telling the stories of patients whose lives were changed forever. These personal accounts counterbalanced artistic metaphors with raw truth. They revealed the intimate human cost behind the symbol. One woman described her mother, once vibrant, after lobotomy. "She was there, but she was not my mother anymore." It was as if the light behind her eyes had gone out. Such testimonies carried more weight than statistics ever could. The ghost in language. Even today, the term lobotomy lingers in everyday speech. People describe themselves as feeling lobotomized after monotonous work, or accuse institutions of lobotomizing creativity. Though often used casually, the word retains its sting, reminding us that behind it lies real suffering. Language preserves memory, and in every casual usage, lobotomy's shadow flickers, a reminder of what was done in the name of healing. The duality of memory. Cultural memory of lobotomy oscillates between horror and pity, metaphor and fact. On one hand, it is invoked as a symbol of conformity and oppression. On the other, it is remembered through the stories of survivors and families who lived with its consequences. Together, these memories ensure that lobotomy remains not merely a historical event, but a warning etched into culture. Art turned tragedy into metaphor. Survivors turned metaphor back into tragedy. Between the two lies the truth. Lobotomy was both a practice of its time and a timeless lesson about power, silence, and dignity. Reflection, art and literature preserve what history might forget. They remind us that suffering is not only recorded in archives, but echoed in stories, images, and symbols. The cultural memory of lobotomy asks us, how will our own age be remembered? What practices today, hailed as progress, will tomorrow be seen as mutilation? In 1949, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to Antonio Egas Moniz for his discovery of the therapeutic value of leucotomy in certain psychoses. At the time, It seemed a triumph proof that psychiatry had finally joined the ranks of legitimate science, capable of offering cures where once there had only been chains and despair. But as decades passed, the award came to be seen not as honor, but as haunting. The gleaming gold medallion, bestowed with applause and celebration, cast a long shadow over medicine, ethics, and history. For how could the world's highest scientific prize have been granted to a practice now remembered as mutilation? The Nobel Prize, meant to crown human achievement, had inadvertently crowned human tragedy. The triumph of 1949. When Moniz received the Nobel, lobotomy was still basking in its golden hour. Across Europe and America, thousands of patients had undergone the procedure, and stories of apparent recovery abounded. In crowded asylums, formerly uncontrollable wards seemed peaceful. Families sent letters of thanks. Administrators celebrated lower costs and calmer institutions. To the Nobel Committee, Moniz's work represented innovation, courage, and progress. He had dared to cut into the brain to relieve mental suffering, and the results, judged by the standards of the time, appeared remarkable. The world, still recovering from the horrors of war, was eager to celebrate a medical discovery that promised healing. For Moniz himself, confined to a wheelchair after being shot by a disgruntled patient years earlier, the prize was vindication. His boldness had been rewarded. He had etched his name into history. The seeds of doubt. Yet, even in 1949, doubts lingered. Some psychiatrists questioned the long-term outcomes, noting that patients often emerged docile but diminished. Critics argued that Moniz's data were selective, his follow-up too short, but in an age starved for hope, these voices were drowned out by applause. The Nobel Prize silenced debate, lending lobotomy the imprimatur of legitimacy. To question the procedure now meant to question the wisdom of science's highest tribunal. For years afterward, the award served as a shield against criticism, a golden halo around a practice already sowing devastation. The burden of legitimacy. The Nobel carries immense symbolic weight. It is not only recognition of achievement, but an anointing, a declaration of what humanity should celebrate. By awarding Moniz, the committee did not simply honor a man, it legitimized a practice. Hospitals cited the Nobel as proof. Newspapers mentioned it as validation. Surgeons invoked it as authority when families hesitated. Thus the prize became complicit in lobotomy's expansion. Every cut of the scalpel, every hammer strike of the ice pick was emboldened by the shadow of Stockholm. The Nobel, intended as beacon, became part of the blade. The paradox of progress. The Nobel Prize to Moniz highlights a paradox. Science is judged in its moment, not in hindsight. In 1949, the evidence seemed promising. The ethical frameworks were looser. The desperation was immense. Within that context, the award made sense. Yet history forces us to ask, should the pinnacle of scientific honor not also account for humility, caution, and the dignity of patients? Was the Nobel a celebration of discovery, or of desperation disguised as discovery? The haunting of Stockholm. As lobotomy's reputation collapsed in the 1952nd and 1962nd, the Nobel Prize became an embarrassment. Scholars and ethicists pointed to it as one of the greatest misjudgments in the award's history. How could the same institution that honored penicillin and DNA also honor a practice that silenced tens of thousands of lives? To this day, the Nobel Committee has never revoked the award. Nobel Prizes are permanent, symbols etched in history. But permanence can be haunting. The medallion awarded to Moniz is not just a relic of recognition, it is a reminder of science's fallibility, the dangers of haste, and the weight of authority. Moni's legacy. Moniz himself remained defiant until his death in 1955. He believed his discovery had opened the door to future treatments, that the failures were outweighed by successes. In his view, psychiatry had been transformed by his boldness. Yet history judges him with greater ambivalence. He was both pioneer and cautionary tale, visionary and violator. His Nobel Prize ensured that his name would never be forgotten, but not for the reasons he imagined. Instead of glory, it cast a shadow, tethering him forever to one of medicine's darkest chapters. The broader lesson. The story of Moniz's Nobel forces us to reconsider the very nature of recognition. Science is not static. What seems miracle today may be judged monstrosity tomorrow. Awards that crown progress must also carry humility, acknowledging the limits of human knowledge and the sanctity of human dignity. In honoring Moniz, the Nobel Committee reminded us that even the highest accolades are not infallible. Authority can be wrong, prestige can sanctify harm, and progress, if measured only by novelty and not by compassion, can destroy as easily as it heals. The shadow that remains. Even today, when lobotomy is invoked in debates about ethics, Moniz's Nobel is often mentioned. It lingers as symbol of science's blindness, a warning that recognition can outpace wisdom. The gold medallion, once gleaming with triumph, now glows with unease. Every time the Nobel Prize is announced for new breakthroughs, genetic editing, brain mapping, artificial intelligence, the shadow of 1949 asks, are we certain this is progress? Or will the future condemn us for our arrogance, just as we condemn the lobotomy? Reflection. The Nobel Prize to Moniz reminds us that history judges not only the actions of doctors, but the accolades of institutions. Recognition, without humility, can amplify harm. The shadow of Stockholm still stretches across science, whispering a question that cannot be ignored. What do we truly honor when we celebrate progress? The lobotomy was not merely an American or Portuguese phenomenon. Its shadow stretched across oceans and continents, finding homes in hospitals from Scandinavia to Japan, from the Soviet Union to South America. Each culture embraced or resisted it in ways that revealed not only medical ambition, but also societal anxieties about order, obedience, and the limits of human freedom. To understand lobotomy is to see not just a single nation's tragedy, but a global experiment that scarred humanity in many tongues. Scandinavia, enthusiasm in the north. Nowhere outside the United States was lobotomy adopted more enthusiastically than in Scandinavia. In Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, thousands of procedures were performed, particularly from the late 1942nd to the 1962nd. In Sweden alone, estimates suggest over 4,500 people were lobotomized. Why the Nordic zeal? Partly it was the influence of progressive psychiatry. Scandinavian doctors were eager to embrace modern methods, and their welfare systems sought efficiency in caring for the mentally ill. Lobotomy was framed as rational, humane, even necessary. It aligned with the era's social engineering ethos. If society could be planned and perfected, why not the mind? Yet darker motives stirred beneath. Many patients were women labeled difficult, immoral, or unfit for motherhood. State institutions used lobotomy not only for psychiatric illness but for behavioral control. The procedure became entwined with eugenic policies that sought to manage populations by eliminating disorder. The silence it created fit too neatly with the demands of order. Decades later, scandals erupted as survivors and families demanded recognition and compensation. The Nordic countries, once proud of their scientific progress, were forced to reckon with the ethical shadows of their past. Britain. Caution and controversy. In Britain, lobotomy, called leucotomy, spread widely, but was tempered by caution. Thousands were operated upon, but British psychiatrists debated fiercely about indications and outcomes. The procedure was often reserved for the most severe cases, though definitions of severity varied alarmingly. Some doctors presented case reports of improved patients, citing reduced agitation or successful discharges. Others warned of flattened personalities and irreversible damage. The British press covered the controversy with fascination, portraying lobotomy as both miracle and menace. By the 1962nd, with the rise of psychiatric drugs, British enthusiasm waned. Yet the legacy endured in the quiet lives of those who had undergone the surgery, many of whom lived out their days in institutions, their voices rarely heard. The Soviet Union. Suspicion and ban. In the Soviet Union, lobotomy was viewed with suspicion from the start. Soviet psychiatrists criticized it as bourgeois medicine, an instrument of Western decadence that mutilated rather than healed. By the late 1952nd, the USSR officially banned lobotomy, denouncing it as incompatible with socialist ideals of human dignity. Yet this rejection was not purely humanitarian. Soviet psychiatry had its own shadows, particularly the use of diagnosis for political repression. Dissenters were often labeled insane and confined. In that sense, while the Soviet state condemned lobotomy as barbaric, it wielded its own methods of silencing inconvenient voices. Japan. Adoption and retreat. In Japan, lobotomy gained ground in the post-war years. Hospitals experimented with the procedure, particularly in the 1952nd, as the country sought to modernize medicine in the wake of defeat and occupation. Thousands were operated upon, though precise numbers are difficult to confirm. Cultural dynamics shaped its use. Families, often burdened by caring for mentally ill relatives, saw lobotomy as relief. Social stigma surrounding madness made surgical solutions appealing. Yet, as in Scandinavia, women and children were disproportionately targeted, reflecting societal expectations of obedience and conformity. By the 1972nd, as psychiatric drugs became widely available, Japanese psychiatry retreated from lobotomy. In later years, survivors and their advocates sought recognition, and lawsuits emerged demanding accountability. South America and beyond. In South America, particularly in Brazil and Argentina, lobotomy found practitioners inspired by both Moniz and Freeman. Hospitals performed the surgery on thousands of patients, often in overcrowded state institutions. Reports describe similar patterns, a mix of genuine attempts to relieve suffering and darker motives of control. In Canada and Australia, too, lobotomy was practiced, with outcomes paralleling those in the United States and Europe. In every nation, the same themes echoed: overcrowded hospitals, desperate families, ambitious doctors, and patients caught between hope and silence. Global patterns. Despite cultural differences, common threads unite lobotomy's global spread. Desperation. In every nation, asylums were overcrowded and alternatives scarce. Lobotomy promised relief. Control. The procedure disproportionately targeted women, children, the poor. and the institutionalized those with the least power to resist. Legitimacy. Moniz's Nobel Prize and Freeman's evangelism gave international credibility, emboldening surgeons across continents. Decline. Everywhere, the rise of psychiatric drugs in the 1952nd and 1962nd led to lobotomy's decline, leaving behind survivors and scandals. Lobotomy was not the failure of one culture or one doctor. It was a global failure born of universal fears and hopes. The reckoning. In the decades that followed, nations began confronting their lobotomy histories. Scandinavian governments issued apologies and compensation. Japan faced lawsuits. In the United States, patient advocacy groups brought the legacy to light. The Soviet Union, ironically, claimed vindication for its ban, even as it faced criticism for its own abuses. The reckoning was uneven, incomplete, but necessary. Each country confronted its past in its own way, revealing how medicine's mistakes cannot be confined within borders. Reflection. The global story of lobotomy reminds us that fear of madness is universal, and so too is the temptation to silence it by force. Across nations, across cultures, the same pattern repeated. Hope, harm, regret. The lesson is not bound to geography. It is human. The question remains, when faced with suffering, will we choose understanding, or will we again reach for the knife? The operating theater is no longer lit by the dim yellow lamps of the 1942nd. Today, in sterile rooms where machines hum like a mechanical choir, neurosurgeons move with microscopic precision. Scalpels have given way to lasers, crude ice picks to robotic arms, and guesswork to brain scans that map the labyrinth of neurons in glowing detail. Yet, beneath the technological brilliance, one can still feel the ghost of lobotomy, a shadow that refuses to fade. The fall of lobotomy did not end humanity's desire to alter the brain. On the contrary, it forced medicine to evolve. By the late 20th century, as the last lobotomies vanished into history, new methods emerged that sought to repair the damaged mind without mutilating it. Among these, deep brain stimulation, DBS, became the most striking. Electrodes, thinner than a strand of hair, could be implanted into the brain to quiet the tremors of Parkinson's disease or ease the crushing weight of severe depression. Unlike lobotomy, DBS was adjustable, reversible, and guided by science rather than blind hope. Patients once locked in wheelchairs now found their hands steady enough to hold a cup of tea. Others, long imprisoned by obsessive rituals, discovered fleeting moments of freedom. But even as miracles unfolded, questions remained. Were these people healed, or were their personalities being edited, reshaped by electric currents? A woman who laughed uncontrollably when her electrode was activated described it as though a stranger had taken residence inside her. A man cured of tremors felt uneasy that a machine governed his movements. This was the paradox. Progress born from the same impulse that had fueled lobotomy, the dream of conquering the mind. Other techniques followed. Surgeons experimented with psychosurgery in miniature, guided by scans that allowed them to sever microscopic connections with astonishing accuracy. Where lobotomy had been a brutal swing of an axe, these new procedures were the stroke of a scalpel. For some, relief came. For others, the results were uncertain. The medical establishment was more cautious now. Every step was weighed against the memory of lobotomy's excesses. Ethics committees, absent in the mid-20th century, now deliberated over every incision. Informed consent became sacred. No longer could a desperate family or a persuasive doctor decide alone. The patient's voice, too often silenced in the era of Freeman, was finally at the center. Yet, even in this more careful age, shadows remained. Neuroscience uncovered new frontiers that bordered on philosophy itself. If electricity could calm a tremor, could it also quiet grief? If a neural implant could lift depression, could it also enhance joy beyond natural limits? Would the pursuit of therapy drift into the creation of engineered happiness? The echo of history whispered warnings. What began as medicine might once again slip into control. The very thought evoked shivers of the past Freeman promising salvation, hospitals eager for a quick solution, families yearning for miracles. Humanity had been down this path before. In modern times, one could not discuss these technologies without confronting identity. Who are we, if our moods, fears, and desires can be switched on or off with a button? A philosopher once asked, if a man with an implant feels happiness only because of a device, is that happiness truly his own, or is it manufactured, like light from a bulb? There were patients who rejected treatment, not out of fear of surgery, but fear of losing themselves. To suffer was, in a way, to remain authentic. Others embraced the chance to silence inner torment, even if it meant accepting a self that was partially mechanical. Thus, medicine entered a twilight zone, no longer crude like lobotomy, but still uncertain in its power, a field that promised salvation yet demanded humility. The ghosts of lobotomy lived on in medical ethics classrooms, where students studied Freeman's mistakes as warnings etched into the canon of psychiatry. They lingered in the hesitation of surgeons who wondered, before every operation, whether they might be repeating the arrogance of the past. And they lived in the memories of patients, those who had been lobotomized and left to wander nursing homes in silence, their fates a reminder of what happens when medicine forgets compassion. Science had learned to move more carefully, but the temptation remained, for in every generation humanity longs for shortcuts to peace. Pills, wires, surgeries, all tools in the same eternal struggle to master suffering. And so, the modern neurosurgeon stands at a crossroad, armed with technology far beyond Freeman's imagination, yet haunted by the same moral dilemmas. The instruments are sharper, the maps clearer, the results more promising, but the question remains unchanged. Where is the line between healing and controlling the human soul? The lights dim in the theater, machines powered down. A patient is wheeled out, electrodes implanted with the promise of a better life. The surgeons remove their gloves, but the silence that follows is not merely clinical, it is philosophical. The same silence that followed lobotomy decades ago. For the brain is not just tissue, it is memory, fate, identity, shadow, and dawn combined. To touch it is to play at the edges of humanity itself, and in that silence, one feels the ghosts stir. Reflection. Every cure is also a question. The history of lobotomy teaches us that healing cannot be divorced from humility. When science reaches into the human soul, it must pause and ask, are we restoring life or rewriting it? The corridors of history are not silent. They echo with the cries of those who were silenced, the voices of families who carried the burden of scars that could not heal, and the uneasy conscience of a profession that once believed it was serving mercy. The story of the lobotomy did not end with the last surgery. It lingered in the courtrooms, in the memoirs of survivors, and in the uneasy reflections of doctors who found themselves on the wrong side of history. When the curtain finally fell on lobotomy, what remained was not triumph, but judgment. The first notes of reckoning were quiet, almost hesitant. Families who had entrusted their children, spouses, or siblings to the care of doctors began to speak of betrayal. Many remembered the day of the operation as if it were a funeral, a date etched into memory when a loved one's laughter, ambition, or tenderness disappeared forever. Some survivors lived on, trapped in a fog of reduced capacity, their identities eroded. Others, like Rosemary Kennedy's sister to a future president, became living monuments to a medical gamble that had failed. Her father, seeking control over her volatile behavior, had consented to the surgery. The result was tragedy. Rosemary was left severely disabled, institutionalized for life. Her fate a secret that the Kennedy family carried like a hidden wound. Her story was not unique. Across the United States and Europe, thousands of individuals bore similar scars. Their names rarely appeared in medical journals, but their absence was felt in empty dinner tables, in the quiet sobs of mothers who could no longer recognize their child, and in the despair of patients who once had dreams but could no longer articulate them. The lobotomy may have aimed to erase suffering, but what it often erased was humanity itself. As the 1962nd and 1972nd brought advances in psychiatry and medicine, the world began to view lobotomy through harsher eyes. Investigative journalists uncovered the scale of the practice, describing how state hospitals had lined up patients like assembly lines. Lawsuits emerged, though most failed legal systems often sided with doctors who claimed they acted according to the standards of their time. Yet each courtroom became a stage where families voiced their grief. The testimony of one mother, recalling the moment she realized her son would never again recognize her, cut through the sterile legal language like a knife. Medical institutions, too, faced their reckoning. Some surgeons defended themselves fiercely, arguing that without lobotomy, patients would have suffered even more trapped in asylums without relief, abandoned by society. Others, more contrite, admitted error, confessing that ambition, pressure, and the allure of being pioneers had blinded them to the deeper costs. In the words of one neurologist decades later, "We wanted to save lives, but in our arrogance, we forgot to ask what it means to live." This divide revealed a broader truth. Medicine is not only about techniques, but about ethics. The scalpel is not neutral. It cuts through the moral fabric of society as much as through flesh. The public memory of lobotomy was also shaped by those who survived and chose to speak. Howard Dully, only 12 years old when Walter Freeman drove ice-pick instruments behind his eyes, would later write a memoir, My Lobotomy. His words carried the pain of a childhood stolen and the bitterness of being made an experiment without true consent. Yet they also revealed resilience, a man who reclaimed his story from the silence imposed on him. In telling it, he gave voice to thousands who could not. Such testimonies transformed lobotomy from a clinical term into a cultural wound. It became a symbol of hubris, of the dangers of unchecked authority, and of society's willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable when answers seemed too far away. Plays, novels, and films, such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, did not just dramatize mental hospitals. They exposed lobotomy as a brutal metaphor for conformity and control. Art became trial, and the verdict was harsh. Yet moral reckoning is never simple. For every voice of outrage there were whispers of complexity. Some former patients or their families admitted that the surgery brought a measure of calm, even if at devastating cost. In a world where asylums overflowed and treatment options were scarce, some believed lobotomy was a desperate attempt to give peace. This ambiguity haunts the narrative. Was it purely an atrocity, or a misguided mercy shaped by desperation? The answer lies not in absolutes, but in the gray territory where intention collides with consequence. Doctors may not have intended cruelty, but cruelty was often the result. Families may have sought relief, but too often relief came as silence, and society, eager for quick solutions to the chaos of mental illness, became complicit by celebrating pioneers without questioning their shadows. As the century progressed, lobotomy was increasingly cast as a cautionary tale. Medical schools taught it not as innovation, but as warning. Bioethics emerged as a discipline, in part to prevent such mistakes, emphasizing informed consent, human dignity, and humility before the unknown. The ghost of lobotomy haunted every debate about psychosurgery, electroshock, and even modern interventions like deep brain stimulation. The lesson was clear. The human mind is not clay to be molded by reckless hands, but a mystery deserving reverence. And yet, the reckoning extends beyond medicine. It forces society itself to confront questions of power and memory. Why were the most vulnerable women deemed too emotional? Children labeled unruly? The poor who had no advocate so often the ones subjected to the knife? What does it say about humanity that, in moments of fear, we surrender freedom for the illusion of control? These questions reach beyond hospitals into the heart of morality. They ask whether progress can exist without compassion, whether innovation is truly advancement if it leaves behind graves of forgotten lives. The reckoning, then, is not only historical, it is ongoing. Every time a new treatment emerges that promises to reshape minds, the memory of lobotomy returns like a shadow in the operating room. It whispers, "Remember what was lost. Remember who paid the price." And perhaps this is the truest form of justice, not a courtroom verdict, nor a public scandal, but a collective memory that refuses to let such wounds fade. For, as long as humanity recalls the silence imposed on thousands of souls, the arrogance that once mistook mutilation for medicine will remain a warning. At the close of this chapter, the narrator pauses not to condemn, nor to absolve, but to ask, can a society ever fully forgive itself for the harm it inflicts in the name of healing? Can the pursuit of knowledge ever be untangled from the shadows of ambition? And if history is itself a kind of surgery, cutting away illusions to expose truth, then what scars remain on us all? The reckoning is not over. It is a mirror. And in that mirror, each generation must decide whether it will repeat the silence of the past or finally listen to the voices that were once taken away. The light of history falls unevenly across the past. Some eras are bathed in brilliance, remembered for their triumphs and celebrated for their vision. Others lie in shadow, carrying the weight of mistakes too grave to be forgotten. The story of the lobotomy belongs to the latter, a chapter written in both hope and blood, ambition and silence. When the first crude instruments entered the human brain, the world stood at a crossroads. Doctors, pressed by desperation, sought cures for suffering that seemed otherwise insurmountable. Families prayed for miracles when institutions offered only walls and neglect. In the hushed corridors of asylums, where screams often dissolved into sobs and silence, lobotomy emerged as both promise and peril. And for a time, it was embraced, hailed in headlines, defended in conferences, and celebrated with medals. Yet, as decades passed, truth pierced through the veil. Behind each success story was a human life, altered, diminished, or silenced. Patients once capable of song fell mute. Daughters who had danced fell into vacant stares. Sons who had spoken with fire now sat motionless in rocking chairs. The shadow of lobotomy grew long, stretching across nations and generations. The fractured memory of medicine. Medicine, like memory, does not forget. It hides and reshapes, but the truth resurfaces. By the late 20th century, lobotomy had become not a tool but a warning, an exhibit in medical ethics lectures, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms. Surgeons who once stood in white coats with certainty were later cited as examples of hubris. Still, the judgment was not simple. Could one condemn entirely those who, in the absence of modern treatments, believed they were bringing relief? Or must one weigh intention against outcome, mercy against harm? It was a question that split the medical world, some branding lobotomy as a crime, others as a tragic misstep on the long path of healing. The truth perhaps lay in between, that good intentions do not absolve great harm, and that ignorance, when combined with ambition, can wound as deeply as cruelty. The survivors' echoes. Among the most haunting legacies of lobotomy are the voices sometimes spoken, sometimes silenced of survivors. Rose Kennedy, once vibrant, was left diminished, her family carrying both love and guilt. Howard Dully, who received a lobotomy at 12, would later write of his confusion, of the childhood stolen by a procedure he could not comprehend. Others could not speak for themselves. Their memories faded, their capacity to protest erased. Families bore the testimony. Mothers watching daughters fade, fathers grieving sons who lived yet were lost. These echoes, scattered through memoirs, interviews, and silent hospital records, formed the chorus of history's reckoning. Each voice reminds us. Statistics are never only numbers. They are names, faces, stories, flesh and blood altered in the name of progress, shadows, and lessons. What, then, does lobotomy teach us? It tells us that suffering can drive humanity to desperate measures, that science without humility courts disaster, and that silence, the silence of patients, the silence of families too ashamed to speak, can allow cruelty to persist under the guise of care. The motif of fire runs through this story. The fire of ambition, the fire of surgical instruments burning through bone, the fire of outrage that later consumed the practice. But with fire also comes ashes, and it is in the ashes that we find reflection. Blood also marks this tale, not just the literal blood of incisions, but the blood ties of families torn between hope and regret. Some parents defended their choice, believing they had spared their loved ones greater torment. Others carried guilt that no passing of time could wash away. And there is silence, perhaps the most haunting motif of all. The silence of patients whose voices were muted, the silence of institutions that avoided scrutiny, the silence of society which too long accepted suffering as invisible. It is this silence that we must resist, repeating, toward healing and memory. The history of lobotomy cannot be erased, nor should it. To remember is to honor those who suffered, to guard against repeating the same mistakes. Each scar in medicine, each shadow in history carries a lesson. Modern psychiatry has moved on, armed with medications, therapies, and technologies once undreamed of. Yet new treatments too must face the same questions. What does it mean to heal? What does it mean to harm? For in every generation there lurks the temptation to move too quickly, to silence dissent, to mistake intervention for cure. The moral reckoning of lobotomy is not confined to the past. It lingers in debates over experimental treatments, over consent, over the boundaries of human dignity. The shadow that remains is not only historical, it is a reminder, alive in the present, the final reflection. As this long tale draws to its close, one image endures: a patient seated by a window, staring outward, half present in the world, half absent. Outside, seasons turn winter snow melting into spring, summer light fading into autumn dusk. Time flows, memory fades, but the figure remains, an emblem of both suffering and survival. The lobotomy era is gone, but its shadow walks beside us. It whispers of the fragility of human wisdom, of the need for humility, of the cost of forgetting that patients are not experiments but lives. And it leaves us with a question, one without final answer. Can humanity forgive itself for the harm it causes in the name of healing? Perhaps forgiveness lies not in forgetting, but in remembering deeply, in carrying the lessons forward. To honor the broken, the silenced, the altered, is to vow, never again shall hope be pursued without compassion, nor science without conscience. And so the story of lobotomy ends not with triumph, nor with despair, but with reflection. A shadow remains, but within that shadow glimmers the faint light of wisdom, guiding future generations toward gentler hands, humbler hearts, and a deeper reverence for the mystery of the human mind.